Good early morning to those of you who are joining us from California. Good morning to us on the East Coast in America. Good afternoon to those of you who are joining us from Europe. And of course, good evening to those of you who are joining us from Cairo. A year ago, Nawal El Saadawi died, and the news spread across the world. The physician, human rights activist, writer, and of course, as we all know, thorn in the side of all tyrants who thought they could get away with injustice and crimes. This once-in-a-lifetime feminist had traveled the world for decades to spread her message of justice for all. On her way, she published dozens of books that were translated into dozens of languages. And wherever she went, she was celebrated with prizes, honorary doctorates, sometimes maligned, and always questioned. And of course, for those of you, and I think many of you who are joining us today, know how tough she was. And so I want to just quote a short statement from Leila Ahmed, who was part of our memorial last year, about which I will talk briefly in a minute. And what she said was, you know, even if you loved Nawal, even if you did not know her, but admired her, there were often times when you would disagree with her. And that was as it should be. So I want to just quote what Leila Ahmed said last year. Am I therefore also saying that I always agreed with Nawal about everything? She has just talked about how deep her sense of loss is. Did I agree with her? Or even that one should always agree with her about everything? Of course not. In fact, one doesn't typically agree or disagree with forces of nature, the wind, the sea, or people of the extraordinary vision, creativity, and imagination of Nawal El Saadawi. And I think in that statement, we hear Nawal. We hear our friend, we hear this woman that we admired from a distance, if we'd not met her. Absolutely extraordinary person who will live on for so many of us in our work. So I wanted just very briefly to talk about what happened last year. So a week after she died, at Duke and also in New York, there were two memorials. So the first was Fawzia Afzal Khan's memorial, brought together a number of Nawal's friends and people who immediately started to think about what the world was going to be like without Nawal. And then I think it was exactly a week later, I organized with Ranji Khanna, who is the director of the Duke Franklin Humanities Institute, this memorial. And the memorial was attended, and I'll give you some names, Leila Ahmed, Zimuniu, who wrote her dissertation on Nawal from Beijing, Evelyn Akkad from Lebanon, Marga Badran from Egypt and America, Robin Morgan, who everybody knows, Sisterhood is Global, Fatima Sadiqi, who was at that time the president of AMUS, the Association of Middle East Women's Studies, who are co-sponsoring this event with us today as they did then. Fawzia Afzal Khan, of course, and in her memorial, she calls what her words, la vie en rouge, life in red. Walter Mignolo, our colleague here at Duke, what I will never forget. Robert Young, in memory of a woman doctor, and we will be hearing a lot about Nawal as a physician, also a physician who gave up being a physician, and you'll hear about that. Zilla Eisenstein, Bruce Lawrence, colleague from Duke, and no secret, my husband. And closing with Ranjit Khanna, a feminist ethos of point zero. So those memorial statements were published in the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies. Let me show you the cover. This is, it has just come out, and it has all of the memorials in there. And I want to close with the words of Nawal and Shereen. So Nawal and Shereen were at Duke for 4 years when Nawal was put on the Muslim extremists death list in Egypt. So that was back in 93. So they stayed from 93 to 97, traveling a lot, but based here. And a course that they wanted to teach, but they put together the proposal to just as they were leaving. So unfortunately, they didn't teach it. But I want to read a piece from that proposal, because in this proposal that was for a course titled The Humanization of Medical Education, they were critiquing the medical profession. And we have a couple of papers that will be dealing with that in the conference. And that is what has happened to medicine. But it is exactly what those of us, particularly in the humanities, are concerned about today, and that is the inability to connect. We can't connect from sociology to political science. We can't connect from zoology to poetry. And that was for them anathema. Everything had to be connected because, as they said, and as Nawal often repeated, our body is connected to tissues, organs, bones, skin, everything is connected. And we cannot heal in any place, in politics, in economics, in sociology, in the craziness that's going on in Ukraine now. We cannot heal as long as we remain specialized, inability as a doctor to talk about the right knee because he specializes in the left knee. So let me read you briefly in closing from their course description. Physicians who practiced medicine in the past were also psychologists, musicians, writers, poets, sculptors, or philosophers. And we have a sculptor, a ceramicist with us who will be talking about that. The dichotomies between science and art, the body and the mind, practice and thought had not yet been established. The human being had not been divided into separate parts, and knowledge was still considered an indivisible whole. I think maybe they're thinking about Avicenna. With the advent of the industrial, post-industrial, and cybernetic eras, resulting in continued scientific and technological innovation, with the increasing commercialization of the professions, including medicine, with the ever finer specialization into branches, the links, their term, the links between the sciences and the arts, between the body and the mind, between emotions and thought, were neglected. Medicine suffered, and so did the human being from this fragmentation of knowledge. Medical practitioners forgot about the arts, about the mind. They forgot that the patient was a human being who could be cheered and perhaps cured by music. Medical colleges now turn out efficient, smart doctors, clever at research, at repairing a cardiac valve or replacing it. Yet they lack the sensitivity, the passion, and the heart without which no profession can be great. This course will explore new approaches to the question of medical ethics. So far, the approach has been confined to doctor-patient relationships or to rules and regulations aimed at ensuring greater protection against medical malpractice. We will examine some of the principles, assumptions, and values which govern medical practice in an attempt to evolve a new perspective, a new medical ethic, capable of protecting human beings and their human rights, capable of keeping them whole. So with Nawal's and Sherif's powerful words, I would now like to invite my colleague and co-organizer of this special event in honor of Nawal Saadawi, Hind Ahmed Zaki.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to some of you, depending on where you are in our world. I'm thrilled and honored to actually be part of this conference and to have had the pleasure to organize it. It's really difficult to talk about Nawal's legacy. Where does one even begin? Honestly, it's an honor that makes me kind of shaky right now as I'm talking, especially since this is like the opening remarks, and I promise they will be brief. But when I was thinking about what to share with you today, I couldn't help but go back to a moment in my own life. That was someday in the winter of the year 2001, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And I was a young 19, 20 young girl trying to understand more about myself and my situation and my subjectivity and everything in between, with a bunch of my other young women. And feminism is what kind of brought us together. I think we were all in some kind of a book club reading about feminist work. We were devouring Saadawi's books, of course, as well as books by Marnisi and others. But Saadawi was very special to us. And then we read in the newspapers and all over the news in Cairo, in Egypt, that Saadawi had been summoned to al-Zananiri court, the court of personal status in Egypt. And Bushi and her husband, Sharif Hatata, on charges of blasphemy. And that not only was she being charged of blasphemy, of insulting the Islam and insulting the nation, but also the court was asking, or the law, there was a call for her to be separated from her husband, Sharif Hatata. Hence, why we were going to the personal status court in Egypt. And if people are familiar at all with the Egyptian personal status law, they would know that it's the only law in the so-called secular Egyptian state that is kind of completely where Islamic Sharia, or I would prefer to say very archaic understandings of Islamic Sharia, continue to reign, especially when it comes to the relationship between men and women. So we went that day full of fear and trepidation. We took ourselves and we were just like walking and shaking, and we entered this very gloomy and terrible building, Zananiri Court in Egypt, in Cairo. And we saw Nawal there with Sharif Hatata, and we sat at the very back. We were very scared, listened to the procedures. And when the judge dismissed the case, we got up and we started cheering and clapping, and we ran to Nawal Saadawi and we hugged her, and we were so happy. I think she was so happy to see us there. There was some of us, we all didn't know each other. We just became friends from this particular day. I think that's kind of, this scene encapsulates who Nawal was in Egypt perfectly, really. It encapsulates what she presented for many generations of women, not just in Egypt, but in the wider Arab world. I think she encapsulated this idea of rebellion, really, more than anything. There's a lot of other feminist activists, there's a lot of other feminist writers all over the Arab world who, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, but who wanted to be a little compromising, who wanted to, work within the state, work within the available institutional setups to try to improve things for women, do more like reform-like interventions. But Nawal always embodied this spirit of rebellion in the really best tradition of feminist rebellion traditions. Like, she just embodied this to us. She embodied this to us. She embodied this to former generations of feminists, and she embodied this to new generations of feminists that are coming out, especially after the Arab uprising. But the little anecdote or story that I expressed in the beginning about the court sums up the reception to Nawal's ideas that often ranged between, ridicule, downright hostility, and this incredible kind of like aggressiveness toward not just her ideas really, but who she was. Because as Miriam eloquently said, we can disagree with the ideas, but I think it was Nawal's personality, subjectivity, as an Arab woman who was an admin socialist, an admin post-colonial, somebody who spoke equally about feminism as much as she spoke about Western imperialism, class struggle. She angered so many people, I think, by who she was and by what she represented. And the receptions to her writings, and the receptions to her passing last year did not deviate that much from the receptions that she had been getting all her life, right? And when I say receptions to Nawal's ideas, I need to be precise here. This reception was not only receptions to Nawal's ideas, hostile receptions to Nawal ideas, were not only expressed by conservatives or Islamists, but also often by people who are supposed to be very progressive on women's issues. For example, a lot of these people would accuse Nawal, echoing back what Miriam was saying, that she has no discipline, that her ideas are too simplistic, too straightforward. Who are you? Are you a sociologist? Are you a historian? Are you a doctor? You're speaking about too many things without the necessary, credentials that we would like to give that, people who do that. But Nawal was interdisciplinary. She was interdisciplinary sometimes even before the word got to be invented. She was also intersectional before intersectionality became a buzzword in feminism, in feminist theory and practice, with, of course, the publication of Kimberly Crenshaw's, landmark article in the 90s. She became very important. She was intersectional in the sense that she always linked her critique of the West and her class consciousness with feminism. These, for Nawal, were always intertwined in her life, in her thought, and in her practice. Also, she was often accused of being, like writing for Western audiences, which, again, something that seems ridiculous to us right now, especially for reading many of the papers that we're going to be presenting over the next couple of days, right? That Nawal was adamantly anti-Western imperialism, and she couldn't stop saying that. In fact, if we want to look at Nawal as a whole and look at sometimes her faults, or some of her, I would like to say, she was not, of course, Nawal was not without her faults. And I think part of what, if we do a reading of Nawal's life and legacy, including her adamant post-colonial stance, it was her adamant post-colonial stance that often made her the target of Islamists and often the targets of Western audiences who were not very satisfied with what she represented as what they think the ideal Middle Eastern feminist should be like. And she was also the target of Islamists and others who did not want to hear all the stuff about the intersectionality that she was talking about. I don't want to take more of your time because we're running out of time, but I would like to kind of maybe conclude by talking about Nawal's legacy and how it's being read today in the Arab world, particularly in the context of after the Arab uprisings and the Egyptian revolution that Nawal was very much part of. Despite all these, like what she steered all her life, I think I would dare say even that Nawal's legacy is really being reevaluated and reread right now by a new generation of Egyptian feminists, younger feminists who came of age during and after the 2001 uprising, but also the Arab uprisings in general. Those young women, and I follow them a lot, believe me, that's my research, they caught her extensively, they relate to her ideas, they think about her all the time, and in ways that even surpass earlier generations of feminists, through which she might have had a more uneasy relationship because they were her contemporaries. And for these young feminists, Nawal really embodies the spirit of the uprising itself. She's the mother of the revolution, as some people have called her, right? And she embodies what this uprising was all about. And I think some of those younger generations are likely to understand Nawal in a less reductionist manner than many others, especially given the fact that, and as we said, Nawal was not without her faults. And one of the biggest, or one of the things that people often throw at us when we talk about celebrating Nawal's legacy after her death is her very recent positions on what was going on in Egypt and the rise of the military dictatorship in Egypt, where she sort of said, and that of course was construed differently by different people, that she would rather have a military dictatorship like that of the current government in Egypt than an Islamist state. This had been, of course, blown out of proportion after her death as part of the reception to her death. And a lot of people have been also talking about how she is very, she can no longer be considered part of this uprising because she said that. She betrayed the revolution. She betrayed the very revolution that she participated in. But I would dare say that even though Nawal was without her faults, and even though she sometimes, because of this, she had to really invest in herself as an individual to continue against everything that was, against all the attacks, all the malicious attacks against her, she often felt isolated, even from the feminist movement that she helped create, whose ideas she helped create. But I would dare say that even though that's the case, Nawal in many ways continue to be absolutely the most important feminist in not only in Egyptian history, in terms of the ideas, in terms of the ideals she represented, but also in terms of the spirit that she embodied. Questions and insights about everything. She talked about everything. She talks about transnational activism and its problems, feminist subjectivity, how to build intersectional allies across, not just in the Arab world, but across, and so many issues that I'm hoping that we will be talking about over the next couple of days and kind of dissecting more this very, very rich legacy that is very difficult to introduce or to talk about in reductionist terms. I will stop here because we are seriously running out of time, and I have to start introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Shereen Abouelnaga, whom we are honored to have with us today, and she is joining us from Cairo. I will, if Dr. Shereen will allows me, I will just be, there's a lot to say about Shereen, and I know Shereen personally, so there's a lot to say about her from me, but since I'm very conscious of time here, I am going to just present an excerpt of what Shereen had been doing, both as a professor and as a writer. So Dr. Shereen Abouelnaga is a professor of English and comparative literature at Cairo University. And she is also a renowned feminist literary critic. She has published books in both Arabic and English, including fiction, works of fiction and nonfiction. And she had written also critical literary articles in scholarly journals with a focus on gender. Aware of her position or positionality in the third word, Abouelnaga views the word from the lens of a socialist feminist and who is seeking to decolonize knowledge, not just about women, but about the word at large. Studying the inter and transcultural encounters in the literature and the arts during the peak of the globalization and its offsprings, like neoliberalism, guides her engagement with the field of culture and gender studies. Forthcoming, I have to mention her earlier book on the Egyptian Revolution, which came out in 2019, correct, Shereen? And that is really a must read. I would say it should be on anybody's list of must-read books on women and the Egyptian uprising. But also she has a forthcoming book about motherhood, which I can't wait to read, as a comparative tool of gender constructs in the global South and North. So she is delving into a comparative study of motherhood from a gendered socialist lens. Thank you so much. And without further delays, I yield the floor to Shereen.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hind, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you, Miriam Cooke, for bringing this the idea of this conference into concrete shape. And I know you have worked, you and Hind, together on that. Thank you for inviting me and for giving me the chance to talk my mind through the mind of Nawal Zaynab. So let me share my screen with you, and please, Griffin, I feel safe since you are there. Griffin, if there is anything about my voice or my screen, please do not hesitate to stop me and tell me. Okay. So I guess now you can see my screen, and this is my title, reading Nawal Zaynab's mind in the death of His Excellency. Now, to my mind, this is the first academic international event, conference, or workshop held in memoriam of Nawal Zaynab El Saadawi. And I'm emphasizing academic. This is a paradox that cannot be overlooked. A woman who was a real troublemaker, a woman who was dragged to court several times on the pretext that she was an apostate, a woman who faced loose charges as blasphemy or contempt of religion, and a woman who is not foreign to prison. Now, at the beginning of her career in 1972, she published her first non-fiction book, Woman and Sex, which led her to losing her job. As simple as that. You write a book, you lose your job. She was the general director of public health education in the Ministry of Health back then. Now, her defiance never stopped. Even after that, she critiqued the Gulf War that took place in 1991 or 1990. Yeah, she critiqued the Gulf War, after which Mubarak closed down the Egyptian branch of AUSA and diverted, and this is for me, this is flaringly, this is the most flaring act I could think of. He diverted the resources of the AUSA to the government-backed organization, women of Islam. Now, court cases continued to trouble El Saadawi. So in 2008, the translation of this play came out. Before that, I think, الإله يقدم استقالته في اجتماع القمة, God resigns at the summit meeting. And in 2008, Nawal successfully fought an attempt to deprive her of her nationality and ban all her writings. That was prompted by the controversy stirred by this play. Now, in between all those dates until the end of Nawal's life, Woman and Sex, God Resigns, and her memoirs, her autobiography. In between all these events, El Saadawi never showed the slightest sign of repentance. She remained the same, perhaps even stronger, and more alarming to all guardians of virtue, identity, and religion. All the gatekeepers of the status quo. So to be part of an international gathering that remembers El Saadawi feels a bit uncanny for me. Now, on second thoughts, I must nuance my statement. El Saadawi has always been inscribed in the US Academy as a celebrity and representative Arab writer, even before Naguib Mahfouz received the Nobel Prize. These are just some of her translated works, as you know, of course. So I shouldn't feel uncanny or weird. I mean, it's only normal to celebrate and remember the woman. Now, the title of this event is Body, Medicine, and Feminism, the life work of Nawal Saadawi. Since I'm trained as an English teacher, I cannot let the phrasing and punctuations go unnoticed. Now, the first item is body. The item or the concept that Saadawi dissected, explained, took issue with its performativity throughout her life. It is actually the word body that caused her the loss of her job, because it came in conjunction with woman. And by the way, after Woman and Sex, Saadawi published Man and Sex. And nobody ever paid attention to that. Nothing happened. So if we link sex to men, it's okay, but when linked to women, it's never okay. This is the cover of Ragul Walgins. Nobody remembers this book at all. And by the way, she is saying the same, somehow it's the same opinions that appeared in her, in Women and Sex, but you know, from just a different point of view, from the masculine point of view. So body, that's the first item. And this is followed by a comma. The body, she came to the body through medicine, and all her mindset was framed by feminism. You know, the function of a comma is to separate each item in a series. A series is a group of 3 or more items having the same function and form in a sentence. So the 3 items are followed by a colon, and a colon introduces an element, or again, a series of elements that illustrates or amplifies the information that preceded the colon. So the life work or life and works of Nawal Saadawi highlight and explain the 3 concepts of body, medicine, and feminism. Now, obviously, one should engage with the mind of Nawal Zaynab through these three concepts: body, medicine, and feminism. Now, in 1972, again, when Women and Sex came out, it was bound to be shocking. Perhaps because the word sex implies an act that is usually carried out in the private, dark, personal sphere, and perhaps because the ambiance all over the world was inclined towards conservatism that wouldn't give up the feminine mystique and the fixed division of gender roles. And this is a fact, actually, that we can see clearly in Adrian Rich's of Woman Born. If you remember that book that came out in 1976. And she was severely attacked. Rich was severely attacked back then. But you know what? Rich later on, after so many years, changed some of her views because of that attack. These views were related to sexuality. But anyway, that's not the issue now. Now, the subtext of the book, of Rich's book, simmers with anger that boils to the surface, even in Rich's most restrained sentences. Now, apart from my speculation, let me state some reliable facts. In the Arabo-Islamic culture, the female body has always been tabooed as the marker, or rather the synonym of honor. Hence, the Arabic slogan, al-ard wal-ard, or al-ard sharaf. This is just an example. I mean, you'll find a lot on Google. Now, this sacred, valuable private body came out in the public, trespassing the terrain of the unset, threatening several paradigms of power relations, and breaching the long-held traditions of class in Islamic history. So back then in Islamic history, early Islamic history, women who were not slaves should cover their body, while slave women, you know, they can just show whatever they want. So it was a class marker. It was just to point at who is a slave and who is not. Now, the sound of silence I hear now tells me you're not yet convinced why all this roar happened around the book, Men and Sex. Let me tell you what was the public sphere like in 1972. Maybe that will convince you, because as Hind said, you know, Nawal is, I wouldn't say false, but perhaps it was Miriam, and she said that we liked Nawal, we respect Nawal, but maybe we don't agree with all that she said. And that was a quote from Layla Ahmed. And Nawal apparently knows that. She was very much aware of that. She says, one of her quotes is, I speak the truth and the truth is savage and dangerous. True. Well, I agree with that. In 1972, here is what happened. Anwar Sadat was trying to justify his lack of action on Israel. And on January 13, he gave a speech where he described the next year as a foggy one, and explained that a war with Israel was unlikely given Egypt's tenuous position and inability to fend off a retaliatory attack by the US should Egypt attack Israel. And immediately after that, students' protests took over the university. And it all started in Cairo University. So the students called for the return of occupied Egyptian territory and for war against Israel. They were forcefully dispersed the next day. So while the police forces were barging into Cairo University, El Saadawi was trespassing the public sphere with a totally different discourse. She was invading the public with the private. She was running with wolves, crying a la Sylvia Plath, so daddy, I am finally through. Daddy, daddy, you bastard, I am through. Now, at this point, political polarization among the students was tangible, and three main groups adopting different political ideologies took shape. The first were the leftist group that had organized the 1972 protests, and they believed that women's liberation is part of the national liberation. The second were the Nasserites, who believed that Nasser already liberated women through the project of modernity. And the third were the rightist group, which derived their inspiration from religious doctrines, and their belief was, and still is, that women are born to remain in the private sphere. Similar to the Victorian angel in the house. Amid this heated national atmosphere, Nawal Zaynab published Women and Sex, arguing for women's equality to men in the right of corporeal dignity and intellectual capacity. Yet women's bodies were never a topic of discussion. To demystify the sanctity of the body through transgressing and crossing the borders of the private, to subvert the institutional discourse of patriarchy, were actions not to be tolerated at all. What happens in the house stays in the house. The private, along with all its contents, diction and psyche, cannot merge into the public. The body is a site on which the private is inscribed, engraved, and read over and over again. The ex-minister in the story of death of an ex-minister was angered by the gaze of a female employee. He couldn't bear this spontaneous self-confidence. He even felt ashamed. Consequently, he decided, and I quote, to shame her as she shamed him. In a hysterical tone, he started shouting, "How dare you? What do you think you are? Don't you know that whoever you are nothing but a junior employee, and I am a minister, and that no matter how far up the ladder you go, in the end, you're a woman whose place is in bed underneath a man," unquote. So the female gaze demolished the masculine position. In the collection Death of an Ex-Minister that came out in 1987, موت معالي الوزير سابقا, in this collection, Nawal El Saadawi reveals the secrets of patriarchy and how patriarchy sustains itself through two major tools: the masculine patronizing gaze and the possession of the female body and psyche. The masculine gaze reduces women to a body, and the body is reified as an object that is a lack waiting to be acknowledged through a masculine gaze. In the story of the mask, al-qina', the narrator, who is a woman, admits that she is attracted to the man sitting in front of her. In this internal monologue, she is fixated on his eyes, trying to analyze her feeling. We, the readers, understand that parallel to this monologue, the man was taking off his clothes. And when the woman, the narrator, realized that, she could not recognize him. Yet, I quote, "His eyes are the only part of his body with which I have real contact," unquote. She has always felt that the regular meetings were a sort of meeting of minds, but she was certain that something was lacking. Love. Then a feeling of repulsion took over her. She says, "It's an inexplicable repulsion linked not to the body, but to history. To the extent that man worships his masculinity, a woman repulses him. A woman's repulsion is the other face of the worship of the male deity. No power on earth can rid woman of her repulsion other than the victory of love over the male deity," unquote. The whole metaphorical scene, of course, implies that possessing the female body is not a real triumph unless the woman develops some real feelings. Any victory is just a myth. This story, where the mask falls, is followed by another entitled "A Masculine Confession." The confession goes that a man cannot admire another man without hating him. However, with a woman, no matter how important she is, one privilege remains mine. This is the confession of the narrator. One privilege remains mine, my masculinity, unquote. Now, let's be cautious not to reproduce all the hasty judgments formulated by Nawal's opponents. A woman against her sex, if you remember George Tarabishi. I read something else, a Saadian amateur, on the pretext that she reduces the whole struggle to a man-woman confrontation, or to patriarchy versus matriarchy, or any other binary. Now, rather, Nawal is trying to trace the origin and trajectory of patriarchy and how it survives and even thrives. This is exactly where the transnational tenet of her vision originates. Masculinity shies away from fighting with another masculinity, because that would be like the meeting of Hercules and Zeus. It turns to what it deems to be weaker, less, lack, void, the female body, or the beauty myth, for example, as Naomi Wolf has explained. So this lack, the woman as a lack, is the point of view of the masculine gaze all the time. And these are the ways of seeing. I need to remind you of John Berger's book, Ways of Seeing. And he talked a lot about the masculine gaze that perceives women as objects gazed at. And they won't have their own existence unless acknowledged by this masculine gaze. So in the first story, the ex-minister could not understand the female gaze and tried to put her down by reminding her that she's only a woman. In the last story in this collection, the female political prisoner, Layla Al-Fergani, who described the president as stupid, was tortured by being incessantly raped, an act that caused her only physical pain and did not dissuade the audience present at court from celebrating her. And here is part from the story. One of them, lying on top of her, had said, "This is the way we torture you women, by depriving you of the most valuable thing you have, Her body under him was as cold as a corpse, but she had managed to open her mouth and say to him, "You fool, the most valuable thing I possess is not between my legs. You are all stupid, and the most stupid among you is the one who leads you," unquote. So shaming the female body is what power usually resorts to. In the case of a man, if the arrested person is a man, he might be flogged, electrified. I mean, we have a long menu we can choose from. But in the case of a woman, she is raped. The man emerges as a hero, while this raped or harassed, sexually harassed woman emerges with a tarnished or rather lost honor. Back to the story, the immediate reaction of the father, who disavowed his daughter once he knew that she was raped, shows how all perpetrators of violence, including women, have assimilated the reductionist concept of the female body. It does not need a lot of effort to realize one of the most absurd self-delusions here. Nawal was advocating the equality of women and men, intellectually and emotionally. It was her opponents who were promoting the binary of man-woman struggle or conflict or confrontation. While Nawal was crossing borders, seeking wider spaces transnationally, her opponents, and they are many, as Hind said, were pulling, pushing, forcing her back to a limited, confined local space. Now, this is a toxic combination of patriarchy and capitalism, augmented by the aid of the institution, like the way, for example, one is brought up as shown in Death of an Ex-Minister, or in school as shown in The Greatest Crime. The greatest crime of Samir was that he loved his mother and feared his father. And when asked by the teacher in school about his full name, he said, Samir Aziza. Later, Saadawi would make a call for women and men to use their mother's names without abandoning their father's names. She simply wanted to reclaim the honor of women's names, the honor of the mother. It was a philosophical idea that caused, again, a lot of roar all over the Arab world. Later, Mona Helmi, Nawal's daughter, wrote an article in Rose Al-Yusuf newspaper and signed it as Mona Nawal Helmi. The usual, someone wanted to sue her, then case dropped, etc., etc. Yet there is this great woman who picked the idea and stick to it until today. This is Siham bint Saniya wa Abd Salam. This is how she writes her name until today. She is an activist, actress, and translator, theater actress. So I have to give Siham credit, actually, because I remember she did that immediately after Nawal advocated for that. The celebration of the mother and endorsing her name was the greatest crime done by Samir, which led the father to commit another greatest crime. He killed the mother. Now, you can definitely read the philosophy between the lines. I read the symbolic hatred of the father and symbolic identification with the mother as a struggle against power. That was Nawal's primary concern, authority and unjust power. That she focused on killing any authority over the female body is her asset and symbolic capital. The body that Nawal tried to liberate from the hold and gaze of authority is stranded in a network of power relations. It is taken to be the cultural marker of identity and honor. So the female body becomes an arena on which beliefs and ideologies are inscribed, on which revenge is taken, and on which discipline is declared. The female body is not an effect of discourse. So we cannot analyze it through, for example, Judith Butler's theory of performativity. And it is not a body that is expected to assimilate modern laws to become a docile body. So we cannot analyze this through Foucault's perspectives. The female body, Nawal has been trying to liberate and is reclaiming throughout the 7 short stories in the collection, is a pre-discursive material being. As I see it, Saadawi was a humanist feminist who, in an interview by Homa Khalili in 2010, that was published in The Guardian, defines herself as a novelist first, novelist second, and novelist third. And she reiterates, for me, feminism includes everything. It is social justice, political justice, sexual justice. It is the link between medicine, literature, politics, economics, psychology, and history. Feminism is all that. You cannot understand the oppression of women without this. So the new generation of men and women whose consciousness was formed during 2011 are, by the way, of the same opinions and beliefs. I myself would repeat the same, perhaps with more emphasis on class. My friend Zaynab, who comes from the south of Egypt, would say the same, with more emphasis on color. Perhaps Hind would say the same, with more emphasis on the politics of research. For us, the socio-political, the public, is not divorced from the sexual and private. The ex-minister in the story could not differentiate the public from the private. Nawal Zaynab brought the private into the political to dignify women, while the ex-minister did the same to degrade women. So why Nawal El Saadawi was incessantly critiqued? Now, the superficial charge never changed. She's adopting a Western agenda. As much as it is always a hollow charge, it resonates with the desire to obstruct the trajectory of transnationalism, interdisciplinarity, and, as Hind said before, intersectionality. That charge started with women and sex and kept snowballing as a result of the American and Eurocentric celebration of Nawal's writings. So 2 powers were pulling the same rope in opposite directions. And the 2 opposite directions were guided by the politics of reception and politics of location and politics of identity. Nawal's writings were received in the West, already saturated with stereotypes, as representative of Arab women's status, a status that lacks historicity, a status that was highlighted and annexed to Islam, only to render the identity of Arab women fixed and unchangeable, a misconception that identity studies is highly concerned with. In the 1990s, the heydays, the climax was that Saadawi as a figure and an icon became like Salman Rushdie's satanic verses, or rather like Rushdie himself, when he became the proxy of animosity between the US and Iran. Saadawi also became the proxy of animosity between the US and the Arab world, especially after the invasion of Iraq. Yet Nawal El Saadawi, who always complained of cultural and intellectual power relations that marginalized and deprived her of being part of the canon, became herself a canonical writer. Starting from June 2010, she became a regular column writer in Al-Masri Al-Yawm, a daily paper. And when she died, she had published 304 articles in that paper. The last one came out in November 2020, and it was entitled, "Which is More Important?" Let me show you that. Yeah, here it is. Well, sorry, it's in Arabic. I believe these articles should be translated, because again, that will help us talk about the politics of location and reception. So it's titled, "Which is More Important, the Issue of Poverty or that of Sex?" And in this article, she recalls the saga of her book, Women and Sex, and takes pride even in her steadfastness. Now, her transnationalism alarmed a specific nationalism that could not face Nawal Zaynab except through a populist discourse. She is really a woman who has always been walking through fire. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have a few questions here, and I invite other participants, if they have questions, to please write them down in the Q&A. There is a small Q&A icon down there on your Zoom, so please feel free to type your questions. We have a lot to say. Thank you so much, Shereen, for such an engaging and wonderful, wonderful lecture. I don't know if you can see the Q&A, Shereen, but you have a few questions from the people, from the attendees. So if you want to take your time to go through them, maybe give each a few minutes response, like a couple of minutes response, that would be great.
Okay.
How about that?
Sorry, can I just say something? So I think in some ways, Hind, if you don't mind reading out the questions.
Of course, I was just about to offer that. Sure,
Okay.
sure.
But I also wanted to mention something. So first of all, thank you so much, Shereen. This was a wonderful talk. But you talked about the text that sent her to court, to Zananir. God Resigns at the summit. She wrote it to Duke. She wrote it in a passion of 5 days. When I went in finally to see her, she was sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers. And she said, "I'm almost finished." She then threw the last piece of paper onto the other pile. So they were numbered, so she knew which order they should be in. She said, I've written this play. I am so sad that, because everything she wrote was in Arabic. I'm so sad that I can never, ever publish this book in Egypt. Could I, Miriam, find a translator, because she wanted it to at least be performed in America. I found a translator, it was performed. And that was 1995. And then to my shock, 11 years later,
came out.
She snuck it. I don't know if you know how that worked. She snuck it in to a pile of publications that she wanted Madbouli to reissue.
Yeah. Okay.
She did not realize that this had never been published before. That's how it came out.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, but when she was taken to court because of that play, the lawyer wanted to strip her of her nationality.
I know.
Yeah, that was absurd. This is absurd. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Thanks, Miriam.
Another example of how outrageous she was.
Yeah. And adamant, Okay, shall I go through the questions? Okay. I don't know if it is...
I think I'm just going to read them, if you don't mind, as Miriam instructed us, just so that everybody listens to the question from me and then the answer from you. So we have a question from Afaf Batina, and please excuse me, Afaf, if I'm mispronouncing your last name.
She's Afaf Batania.
Thank you so much, Shereen. Sorry, Afaf. Afaf Batania. Thanks, Shereen. Will the death of the author Nawal here, and consequently the absence of controversies her strong personal presence created, make the reading of her texts more objective, in the sense that readers will focus on her texts rather than her gender and nonconformity? I think that's a very important question. So if you can take some time to...
Afaf, glad to hear from you. Afaf is a researcher and a writer, novelist from Jordan. Afaf, this is related to the idea of compartmentalization. One of the charges, as I think Hind and Miriam mentioned at the beginning, was that if you are a doctor, you stay as a doctor, you are into engineering, you stay there. And this is an issue that I remember Edward Said talked about a lot, that women should write about women, Black should write about Black, and so on and so forth. So because Nawal El Saadawi crossed all borders of specializations and compartmentalizations, and she didn't want to be the neoliberal expert of the 21st century. She talked about everything, psychology, politics, as you know. So it depends on the researcher, see how you want to read Nawal. So as for me, I thought that it's just a few books by her are known: Woman at Point Zero, her autobiography, In Prison, Love in the Kingdom of Oil, The Fall of the Imam. And I realized that this collection of short stories, it's not really very known. And I liked it. I thought that all her opinions are there. But then I can read Nawal El Saadawi from a different perspective. I can look, for example, at the debate between Nawal and Hiba Raouf, Ad-Din wal-Akhlaq wal-Usra. So you can do that. You can read Nawal El Saadawi as a doctor and her views about the ethics of practicing medicine, and so on and so forth. So it depends, but definitely everybody, whoever the reader is, whatever the angle any reader is going to pick, the nonconformity and the rebellious spirit of Saadawi is going to be the major guiding rule. I hope I've answered that. But Hind, there is a question before that. Have you seen it?
The one about Nawal El Saadawi and Zayed, correct?
Yeah.
I actually said I would like to answer this question live whenever I have a chance, because I felt like so. Yeah. Shereen, why don't you take this and I will offer my own intake on this as well. Please.
Oh, right. Well,
I really hate this most famous thing. So that was my intervention, really. But I don't know what you feel about this.
So I don't know why whenever I open Google, I find Mr. Google says Latifa Zayat was feminist. Latifa Zayat was never a feminist, never a feminist. Okay.
And she's wonderful, but she was not really a feminist. Yeah.
No. She was even against that. Okay. She wouldn't tolerate the word. And just before her death, 2 years before her death or something, she wrote a testimony that was published in Adab wa Naqd, a leftist, wonderful journal that comes out in Egypt. She wrote a testimony. She says, I used to say there is no feminist literature or masculine literature. But now at this age, I can say that when I write fiction, part of me as a woman comes out. But when I write criticism, no, it's still the same. So at least there is, this mild confession that there is some specificity about women's writings. But Latifa Zayat was never a feminist. And, not every woman who writes would be a feminist. Because feminism, after all, is a vision and ideology. And even if we're thinking of al-bab al-maftuh, the open door, that was not about liberating Layla, it was about liberating Egypt. So Layla actually was the synonym of Egypt.
Very true.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, thank you, Shereen. I couldn't have said it better. We can have a whole conversation about also a lot of women of these generations, especially those who come from the Arab socialist Marxist tradition, who felt very wary about labeling themselves as feminists and had continued to, to kind of hold this position until later in life when they finally, okay, a lot of my writings can actually be construed as feminists. A lot of people are reading Arwa Saleh these days, and I know that there's a revival of interest in Arwa Saleh, who's like of a younger generation. Arwa Saleh, for those who don't know her, is a famous Egyptian Marxist political activist who wrote this very important book, a scathing critique of the left in Egypt, but also a scathing critique, an analysis of Egyptian politics. And she was talking about gender politics in the left. A lot of people read Arwa Saleh as a feminist, but Arwa Saleh, I would say, had never actually expressed herself as a feminist. In fact, she was always very wary about this. So yeah, I join in answer to Jeremy's question. It's very important to distinguish between writings that discuss women and feminism and feminist writings and feminist thought. And for me, feminism is a political project as well as an intellectual enterprise. So Nawal El Saadawi wrote works of nonfiction about that Shereen had talked about, like all these books are nonfiction as well as fiction books about feminism. Latifa Zayat was an incredible novelist who wrote about women issues, and her personal autobiography, I think, is one of the best works of autobiography written in the Arabic language, really. حملة تفتيش أوراق شخصية. But to go as far as to say that she is a feminist, right? I don't think she herself, also the late Latifa Zayat, would have been comfortable being put as a feminist writer, first and foremost. So I agree with Shereen completely. Yeah. So Shereen,
I know, but I also know that Jermeen Shahata is working on her PhD thesis, and she's writing a chapter on Latifa Zayat.
Wonderful, wonderful. Looking forward to reading your work, Jermeen. We would love to hear more about this and to hear your reaction to it, hopefully. Yes, Asma wanted to say something, so please, Asma, go ahead.
Yeah, do you hear me clearly?
Yes, we do.
So yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you that Zayat never identified herself as a feminist, as many like other like Egyptian or like Arab women writers. But I think because she didn't like say explicitly that she is a feminist, that doesn't mean that she is less feminist than al-Saadawi, or should be read differently. I think like even though she's not identified as a feminist, I read her, and I read her books, the Search and The Open Door, from like as a feminist text, even though she's not like vocal about her feminism. If we define feminism as, I mean, you can define feminism differently, of course, but I think she is not less feminist than al-Saadawi, because if you would define feminism as political activism, so al-Zayyat would fit that perfectly. I mean, she was imprisoned with al-Saadawi, and she was put under surveillance for that for a long time. So I think, and even The Open Door, I mean, so many critics read the Open Door is just a liberation for the nation, and read Layla as a metaphor for Egypt. But I think we cannot just read the book as like that, because there is a love story and there is sexuality in the novel as well.
Okay, we can talk about this forever, and Dr. Hanan Hamed is with me here, and she wants to say something about it as well. So I know that we would disagree on this. Okay, so unfortunately, Hanan, people who are in the audience are not allowed to do that. So if you want to type your response, I will be happy to read it. Hanan Habibti, if you hear me, please. But I just want to say something about how we can read certain texts as feminists without the authors themselves labeling themselves as feminists. And when I say feminist activism as politics, I don't mean politics as such. Latifa Zayyat was a socialist. She was a socialist activist. She was imprisoned twice for being a Marxist, not for being a feminist activist. One in the late 1940s and another time in 1981, when Sadat literally imprisoned everybody in Egypt at this point. So and I honestly want to say something here about the most famous feminist or feminism as a label, because I think we often want to say that somebody is feminist or not, and this is often construed as an insult or as taking something from someone when we say she's not a feminist. That's not an insult, honestly, because I think, as you're saying, feminist politics could be part of leftist politics, could be part of politics as such. But to call somebody a feminist thinker or someone who has devoted their lives to the question of women is a different thing, correct? Like, we can all do certain things in our lives that are feminist acts, feminist writings, feminist actions. And of course, Latifa Zayyat had done that. Nobody can even deny that, right? And in a country like Egypt, when you become a luminary woman, a woman who had done important things in life, not just in writings, but in any other occupation, there tends to be a tendency to say that she is a feminist or she represents something important to feminism, which is true, of course, like, because she is a woman in the public sphere. But that's very different, in my opinion, from calling someone a feminist politician or a feminist activist or a feminist thinker. And here, I think, lies the difference, if I can rephrase what Shereen and I were trying to say, between somebody like Saadawi and somebody like Latifa Zayyat and others, of course. We can put so many people in the bracket here, not just Latifa and Saadawi. So anyway, we can go on forever. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, because honestly, when we talk about Saadawi, when we talk about Latif, the question of what feminism is, or what feminist politics or thinking is, has to come into play. So I'm looking forward to discussing this more with you, Asma, over the next couple of days. Hanan, if you can write it, Asma said it well. Great, thank you, Hanan. I think Hanan, I'm just going to read Hanan. I would add, considering the historical context in which the term feminism, this is Dr. Hanan Hamed, professor of history, of modern Egyptian history at the Texas Christian University, for those of us who don't know. I would add, considering the historical context in which the term feminism was more associated with the West, which is very true, of course. That was not flattering to many activists and intellectuals who are actually doing feminism in praxis, rather than adopting the label. El Zayat's statement about how sex was the reason she married a reactionary man, again, going back to Hamlet Taftish أوراق شخصية, which is really one of my favorite autobiographies ever written by an Arab woman or man, was the reason she married a reactionary man, in my opinion, is one of the most Arab feminist statements. Definitely, Hanan, very well taken. And this conversation could go on forever. So for the sake of our time, I will cut it here and we can go back to it. I think there was we don't have the time, unfortunately, for all these questions, but there was a question by Dalia Goma that I feel is very important here. About your theoretical framework, Shereen. If you reject Butler and Foucault's theoretical paradigms, and you pointed out that Western theoretical frameworks confine our examination of Saadawi's work within these preset stereotypes, what would you propose as an alternative paradigm to read Saadawi right now in 2022?
Wonderful question, Dalia. Dalia is a dear colleague in the Department of English, Cairo University. Well, when I talked about Foucault and Butler, and these are just examples, I'm concerned about the concept of the body, how we can deal with the body. So how the kind of the body that Saadawi deals with is not the body Foucault is talking about, or the body that performs and becomes just an effect of discourse, as Butler has proven. It is just a material body that exists there. So when I was saying these are not valid frameworks, I was referring to the concept of the body. But then if you want to read Saadawi actually, you can read her works, I'm speaking about fiction, intersectionally, transnationally. They yield themselves also easily to comparative readings. And I believe that all the time we need, for me, I'm all the time preoccupied with the private and the public, how all the time she was trying to say the two are linked, no separation between the private and the public, because this is the problem as I see it. Somebody has done that to us. I mean, well, that's a long history. We can go back in history, and we are just paying the price now. We are trying to prove again that the public and the private are just one thing. You know, I believe that the personal is political. Even though this could be a slogan of second wave feminism, the personal is political and the political is personal. And this proves very true in this current moment in the 21st century. So a war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, and I am here in Egypt, and I am affected just right here in my house. This is just an example that from the top of my head. So the personal is political, I must say. So we need to look at the private and the public all the time, and who is sustaining that? Who are the perpetrators who really want this separation to remain as it is? So we can look at the private and the public. We can look at intersectionality. Yeah, I hope I've answered your question, Dalia, but we can keep talking about that later. You are muted, Hind.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. I think we have time for one final question, maybe, which is, it's very difficult to pick, but I think most of the questions that I'm seeing here could be answered quickly. I'm just picking a question that I'm personally, it got me thinking. Did Nawal have a response to the mass sexual assaults that occurred during protests in Cairo? To your knowledge? To my knowledge, I know that Nawal had written extensively about the use of rape within political context, and also had written about the everyday mainstream taharrush, street harassment that happens in Egypt, right? That's been a phenomenon that had been written about and documented. But maybe the question goes back to Nawal's reaction to the uprising. If you want to add something to that at all. And I'm sorry, Shereen, you seem to be coughing like me, so take your time, please.
No, it's okay. Well, you know what? The whole oeuvre of Nawal El Saadawi would just tell us about her position towards sexual harassment or rape or anything, the whole oeuvre. So, but anyway, if we want to be specific, here we are. Nawal El Saadawi, it's just coincidence that where when she came in, and I was very happy to see many people, celebrating her. And she was talking about that to the people. Anyway, she wrote in the articles of Al-Masri اليوم, because this continued until 2020. Yes, she has many articles about that. And she wrote another article, by the way, in Ahram about also sexual harassment. Yes. And if you look at all her works, I mean, her position is already known.
Yeah.
You cannot doubt it. Yeah. And this short story that I quoted from about this woman, the political prisoner, Layla al-Firgani, who was incessantly raped, I mean, it says it all. So, yeah, she has, of course, her position about reifying women, objectifying women, possessing the body of women and how this feels a victory for masculinity and patriarchy. Yeah.
Okay. I think that applies also to Dr. There was a question about the commodification of women from Dr. Minkashi Kulkarni, and I think that really, it sums up what Shereen had just said, sums up also the answer to this question, which is we can read the entire, body of works of Nawal as an expression against the commodification of women, as placing herself as an anti-capitalist, anti-socialist feminist for sure. I think we need to take a break now. I'm so excited about this. This is turning out to be an incredible discussion. Thank you so much for our attendees as well for posing these very important questions, I think. And I'm looking forward to expanding more and more on that. I think we can take a couple, we can bring up, I think we can take up how much do we have time, Griffin? Like 5 minutes, I would say, as a break, and then start.
Yeah, I think 11:40 is good. Give a 6-minute break.
Yeah, 7 minutes to be precise. So
okay.
That's great. So we will be back in 7 minutes for our first panel. Thank you guys so much. Looking forward.
Thank you.
To start our first panel, we have a very exciting and wonderful set of papers here. And I am going to start by introducing our panelists. And please forgive me if I introduce them not in the order in which they will be talking, but I thought that I would do an impromptu introduction of our panelists. So our panelists today are, I will start by Dr. Jessica Frazier. Dr. Jessica Frazier is an associate professor at the University of Rhode Island in the History of Gender and Women's Studies departments. I'm also affiliated with 2 departments, so we have to say departments. Her current book project, Creating Transnational Feminist Networks from 1940 to 2000, traces the genealogy of transitional feminist praxis in the late 20th and early 21st centuries through collective biography. Her first book, which is titled Women's Anti-War Diplomacy During the Vietnam War Era, published by the University of North Carolina Press, was chosen as a 2017 Outstanding Academic Title by Choice Magazine. And her research interests revolve around transnational feminism, social movements, intersectionality, and human rights. Welcome, Dr. Frazier, and we are very excited to hear your work. Our second panelist for today, or again, without order, is Mohamed Tonsy. So Mohamed Tonsy is an Egyptian writer and ceramist. Wow, interesting. Who would like to hear about your ceramic art or poetry, Mohamed, definitely. Who recently completed a PhD in creative writing at the University of Edinburgh. His writing has appeared in Mesna and Epoch Press, and it was shortlisted for the MFest's 2021 short story competition, and also won a quarterly John Byron Award. His debut novel, You Must Believe in Spring, is forthcoming with Hajar Press in September 2022. Thank you very much, Mohamed. We look forward to hearing you. And finally, last but not least, of course, we have Dr. Lucinda Carspecken. And Dr. Lucinda Carspecken is a lecturer in qualitative and quantitative research methodology at Indiana University. She is interested in non-cognitive aspects of social inquiry. Incredible, really. I can't talk to more about all of this with you, Dr. Carspecken, and its history. So she's interested in non-cognitive aspects of social inquiry and its history. And she recently edited Love in the Time of Ethnography, Essays on Connection as a Focus and Basis for Research in 2018, which looks at relationships as a way of knowing. Her current writing explores historical examples of ethnography and auto ethnography. Thank you, Dr. Lucinda. We're excited to have you. So what order do we have, Griffin? Because I don't have the correct order. I just want to make sure that I follow it.
Mohamed is first.
Mohamed is first. So please go ahead, Mohamed. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. And I'm just honored to be among such a kind of like an amazing group of panelists. This has been an incredible discussion so far. So yeah, I'll just share my screen real quick. Sorry. Sorry. Okay. Oh, okay.
Please let us know if you're having any difficulties, Mohamed, because Griffin can probably share your PowerPoint or your presentation if you can, but take your time.
Okay, just sorry.
No worries.
There we go. Okay, so my discussion today will be on Nawal El Saadawi's use of language and repetition to manipulate the narrative space, essentially kind of looking at the corpus of the, like how she kind of extends the corpus of the text onto the reader. And for this presentation, I'll be looking at the Mawt al-Rajul al-Wahid al-Ard, or God Dies on the Nile. So God Dies on the Nile is a novel that El Saadawi has herself actually called her most important piece of work. Although oddly enough, kind of like there wasn't much scholarly work done on it, which I just found very curious. And most of what was there was kind of about the symbolism and parallels between the politics presented and the contemporaneous politics from which she was writing. But that's not what I'll be discussing. When I first read this book, it felt very much kind of like almost an embodied thing where I was drawn in very much by the text, and very much kind of like the interaction between the reader and the text is what I find most interesting. And okay, so before diving into the novel, there are a few bits of terminology that I just like to run through as they're important to how I go through the text. First of all is the term narrative units. So I took Roland's broad definition of narrative units here, and it's just a way of differentiating between the linguistic unit, which is essentially the word you see on the page, and kind of like essentially the affective nature of the word itself. And this will kind of like become more obvious as we go through the discussion. The difference is just important to note because it will elaborate on how various characters are perceived in different ways by the reader based on how they appear on the page. Zakia, for example, is shown to be able to transcend the linguistic barrier set upon her by her name, while the mayor, being a slave to titles, both on the page and in his own character, fits perfectly within his linguistic units. But kind of I guess the first question is kind of like, why draw this difference? And it's because I felt very much kind of from the text that Saadawi was pushing back against certain limitations within language and kind of what language can do essentially, and that her characters were struggling with the same thing. So yeah, by not kind of merely relying on the linguistic units to transfer over meaning, the text manages to grapple with issues parallel to the ones tackled by the narrative itself. So while the text, for example, grapples with issues of colonialism, authoritarianism, patriarchy, social and gender inequality, and imperialism, the book, as a corpus, struggles to push against the boundaries within which it was itself placed. So, to get into the book, the first lines of the narrative kind of set expectations of what the day's rhythms will bring before being subverted by Zakia. Before the crimson rays of dawn touched the treetops, before the cry of the cock or the bark of the dog or the bray of a donkey pierced through the heavy darkness, or the voice of Sheikh Hamzawi echoed in the silence with the first call to prayer, the big wooden door opened slowly, creaking with the rusty sound of an ancient water wheel. So, at this point in the narrative, Zakia is still left nameless, and it's only after her and the buffalo's shadow disappeared into the darkness to emerge out of it again over the riverbank that Zakia is ever given a name. So the reader gets a sense of the space that Zakia occupies within the narrative before we ever learn her name, and it is in that sense that she transcends the linguistic unit that she is assigned. The mayor's entrance, on the other hand, is quite different though. His entrance reminds us of what we were discussing in the previous slide, which is that the way the mayor is introduced tells us more about the lens that we're viewing this narrative from than what the content relates. So while Zakia is, in a way, subverting all of the expectations of how the day should start, the mayor merely needs to open the iron door and walk outside, and he is seen. So what does this do to the reader? It essentially gears their eye towards their own expectations which Nawal El Saadawi consistently disappoints. And I'm not kind of like placing any kind of like sense of success or failure on this. It is a tactic that she uses within the narrative. So it's kind of like what Hans Robert Jauss says. The most important moment is the disappointment of expectations. It resembles the experience of a blind person who runs into an obstacle and thereby experiences its existence. Through the falsification of our assumptions, we actually make contact with reality. So what is this expectation that's being kind of upset? It is the unwritten contract between reader and text, whereby the text is meant to shroud what it's trying to do under the veil of language, or that would be the case if it weren't for Dr. Nawal's interventions that explains kind of like Zakia's difficult life. I think maybe I should just take a moment and kind of like give an overview of what happens in the actual narrative, since I will be talking about various events within it. So essentially it is set in Kafrulteen, and it follows like an array of characters. The most prominent of is Zakia. So Zakia works on a farm and lives with her brother Kafrawi, and they have been continuously subjected to the oppressive forces of the mayor, who kind of like has very much an iron grip over the town. And Zaki had already or Kafrawi had lost his daughter, Nafisa, because the mayor had coerced her into sex before essentially she had to run away because it was implied that she was pregnant. And so it follows kind of like all of the, and they kind of like continuously find themselves at the brunt of like sorry. And they continuously just kind of like find themselves kind of like at the mercy of the mayor, who's very much kind of like this large, overwhelming authoritarian figure. And the story is just about kind of like how they interact with each other, and it very much kind of like explores what Dr. Shereen was also saying, kind of like the socio-political aspect and the class aspect of oppression and how it affects women and how it affects men as well. But okay, so back to the writing. So as stated, like what's most central to Dr. Nawal's writing is the phenomenological aspect of the writing. So rather than just showing the reader what the various characters, what the various narrative units like Zakiya, Kafrawi, the mayor, etc. are orientated towards, it exposes how this phenomenological orientation occurs. Essentially, it exposes kind of like the systemic injustices to which the novel's form itself is also subjected. With the characters' bodies being restricted within rigid social and structural frameworks, al-Saadawi exposes to the reader the main ways the phenomenological I itself, which is the reader, is also complicit in this process. This means that although al-Saadawi's characters might try to liberate themselves, text itself forces the reader to also examine their own expectations within al-Saadawi's fiction. Sorry. Back to the text though. So following Zakiya's entrance into the narrative, where her appearance already disrupts expectations, because she kind of, before the crimson rays of dawn touched the rooftops and all of that happened, we are faced with her. So, oh my God, sorry. The Ramadan and fasting has just done its absolute job on me. I'm sorry.
Don't worry, Mohammed. Please, we're really enjoying this, so don't worry at all.
Yeah. So after Zakiya's entrance, where her appearance disrupts expectations, the narrative voice elaborates on the boundaries of Zakiya's narrative unit. So we're told that her shadow and the buffalo shadow descended the slope into the ditch and got lost in the narrow twisting lanes as they glided furtively along between the houses. They came to a stop in front of the big wooden door. Zakiya opened it with a push of her powerful fist, and it gave way with a heavy creaking sound. And then she sat with her eyes facing the open door so that she could see the part of the lane which lay beyond it. And then the next time she moves is only to feed herself, and it is portrayed in a very disembodied fashion. She put out her hand and fumbled in the dark for the flat straw basket containing the week's store of food. She pulled it up to her side, parted her tightly closed lips, and began to feed little pieces of dry bread, dry cheese, and salted pickles into her mouth. So essentially, it very much feels like there's a difference between where the narrative unit of Zakiya lies and where the linguistic unit, which is kind of like the word Zakiya that we see on the page, rests. Because even when she feeds herself, it is a disembodied she that feeds herself. It is not a named person. And this kind of like very much reminded me and rang true when I was listening to Dr. Shereen talk about the difference between the body of the woman and the psyche of the woman. And here in this narrative, that's very much emphasized. So yeah, the reader is not told that Zakiya is hungry, but is only made aware that the source of the pain is in her stomach. The link is left for the reader to bridge without compromising Zakiya's boundary as a negative space within the narrative. by maintaining her interiority as unknowable. So to reaffirm her presence in the narrative space, Zakiya keeps her eyes fixed on the outside world through the wooden door, the object through which the reader was first introduced to Zakiya. So it almost kind of like feels that within the narrative, if she breaks that contact, she almost kind of like doesn't exist to the outside world. And then her brother comes in. And when the reader is first introduced to Kafrawi, he's visible to the reader, but not to Zakiya. So there's definitely a hierarchy visible between the various narrative units. Kafrawi's entrance is much more linear than Zakiya. Dr. Saadawi just writes, she could no longer see anything in the total darkness, even when her eyes were wide open. Kafrawi slipped in through the big wooden door and squatted down beside her. She was looking straight at him as he came up, so he thought she had seen him, but although wide awake, she had not really seen the man he had become. So while it is more linear and kind of like almost closer to the mayor's introduction later on, it is still not like Zakiya's introduction. And there's very much kind of like links back to ideas of class, power dynamics. As it was said before in previous analyses of God Dies on the Nile, all of the men. And they say that themselves, that while they're subject to God only during prayers, they're subject to the mayor all of the time. And yeah, that's something that echoes as well in how they're presented and how the narrative units are laid out. So in others of El Saadawi's narratives, such as Woman at Point Zero and a story from a female physician's life, the narrative being relayed is embedded through a narrator who's reporting on events that as they're related to them, adding a second layer of subjectivity. But while there is no embeddedness in God Dies on the Nile, the fact that the narrative unit creates a quasi-narrative structure that's accessible to the reader points to a further embeddedness, one occurring through the reader themselves. God Dies on the Nile abandons the heightened role of the physician as one capable of commanding the literary medium. So there's no kind of like almost hierarchical structure from the narrator to the reader, but it's almost more of a collaborative thing. And all El Saadawi does is provide readers with a tool to dissect the narrative as they wish. Ideally, it is what most literary works do. However, Saadawi has always been on the fringes of being considered literary due to the fact that she does not hide what the novel is doing behind like literary machinations. And I should point out that the reason that I'm also kind of like that I've approached this novel with this type of analysis is that the idea of repetition and disembodiment, especially disembodiment of words, is something that kind of like recurs throughout Saadawi's work. In the circling song, there's almost this constant kind of like sense of refrain, a constant kind of like repeatedness, where the characters are left very ephemeral, except for how the reader interacts with the text. And same as well in Searching, it's a novel that follows a scientist who's opening up a research center and is kind of like looking for a lost lover. But at the same time, when she's walking the streets, there is the sense that she cannot make sense of street signs. All of the words and all of the lettering look like disembodied limbs. And as you can see, kind of like from the side I was writing, this sense of embodiment is something that really does show through the text. So yes. And other instances of repetition as well that kind of like force the reader to kind of like become aware of the text as a narrative that's doing work on them. For example, is there are repeated scenes where male elders from the village are shown to coerce young women into doing their bidding. In one case, Fathiya is forced to go and marry Sheikh Hamzawi, and in another, Nafisa is forced by Kafrawi and Sheikh Zahran to go work for the mayor, which ultimately leads to her banishment and the mayor assaulting her. And it is very much kind of like because of that repetition, the reader becomes aware of their role within the narrative, of kind of like the importance of their interpretive role. So yeah, and when the reader realizes that these two instances directly mirror each other, yeah, when they realize that both of these instances directly mirror each other, so sorry.
Mohamed, that's totally fine. I was asking you if I could ask you just to wrap it up a little bit, because we're sort of running out of time. But believe me, it's totally fine. Don't worry about anything.
Yeah. So yeah. So the reader is very aware of kind of like their position within the narrative as very much a collaborator in this sense. And it is El Saadawi's way of actually kind of like imparting a bit of agency onto the reader and a bit of responsibility. El Saadawi wants to make the reader feel complicit and like they have a hand in what's happening. I think the most difficult thing is that, for example, because of the repetition of certain instances like that, the reader is also aware that there are systemic injustices that the novel is reflecting on that are almost out with their control. So by, and kind of like by being aware of their complicity, the reader views the narrative differently, and they kind of like view the narrative units changing as being very different. And this comes to a crux at the end of the novel, in a chapter where, after kind of like essentially just oppressing, enacting his oppressive rule over quite a few of the people in town, the mayor has coerced Zaynab into coming to work for him by setting up an elaborate scheme, essentially to get her to be told by a sheikh from the Sayyidah Zaynab to come and work for him if she is to atone for her sins and to make her mother better. Because throughout the narrative, obviously for those of you who read it, Kafraoui is arrested because he's suspected of having killed a member of the community that the mayor was actually responsible for killing himself. Not personally, but yes, by proxy. And
Mohamed, I am so sorry. I think you need to wrap it up. Yeah, well,
all right, okay, yeah.
Wrap it up, thanks.
Yeah. So yes, but essentially the very last chapter, the reader realizes, because Saadawi sets up the scene of coercion between Zaynab and the mayor as if it's something that's already happened. And because it's set up in a temporal way that's already being embedded in the past, the expectations are set and the expectations are being fulfilled. So we're being told the story from the chapter from the point of view of the mayor at that point. And the mayor kind of like lays out his expectations of he will do this to force her to do that, and it follows through. And it is such a horrific chapter that kind of is meant to essentially force the reader to contend with their direct complicity. And it essentially forces them to ask kind of like, what is the use of a mayor if all that they enact is oppression? And but it also takes away complete agency from the reader. And that's kind of what I found most interesting, because it forces, essentially, the crux of the novel forces the reader to break down and to
break down the barrier between the reader and the text and the author, I guess. Yeah.
Not just to break down the barrier between the reader and the text, but break down but also show that Saadawi essentially is challenging the reader. That given that this is the complicity, what is the question that they ask? Do they ask themselves kind of like, what is the use of such a ruler, or kind of like, what is my own complicity?
Yeah.
And yeah.
Thank you so much.
I'll just.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. After this presentation, we move next to Jessica. Please. The floor is yours, Jessica.
Griffin, you can take your time. I just wanted to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to be here today, including Miriam Cooke, Hind Zaki, Griffin Orlando, and Ellen McLarney. And I'm going to begin my presentation with a quote. So few people have been so consistently in demand at meetings and discussions at the NGO forum as Nawal El Saadawi, the Egyptian doctor, writer, activist, and feminist, end quote, declared press coverage of the UN's, the United Nations Second World Conference on Women in Copenhagen in 1980. Nawal El Saadawi, an advocate for women's rights in the Arab world and outspoken critic of President Anwar Sadat's regime in Egypt, quickly gained international attention during the 3-week-long meeting. There were 2 parts to the Second World Conference on Women, the quote-unquote official conference, which was attended by UN delegates and diplomats, and the NGO, the non-governmental organization forum, open to activists and other interested parties. And it was the second conference in a series of 3 conferences dedicated to women for the UN Women's Decade, which was from 1975 to 1985. Now, because El Saadawi was an advisor at the UN's Economic Commission for West Africa in Beirut, and had studied Arab women's rights issues for years, the Conference Secretariat and Planning Committee invited her to speak at a 2-day pre-conference journalist encounter, as well as at 3 panels during the NGO forum. So clearly El Saadawi was already known well enough in some circles to merit such invitations, but her forthrightness and outspokenness at the Copenhagen conference launched her into the international realm and allowed her to create transnational bonds of feminist solidarity on her own terms. If you can switch the slide now, thank you. So this paper builds off of scholarship on Nawal El Saadawi's life and work. And both literary and Arab world scholars, which we've already beginning to hear, have written much on El Saadawi, focusing on her writing and analyzing the ways in which she combined her many roles as a doctor, a psychologist, an author, and an advocate to bring attention to the injustices that she saw in the world, in Arab society, and in Egypt through her publications. Now, other scholars have focused on the ways in which Nawal El Saadawi's work has been misread by feminists, journalists, and politicians in the global north, especially in the United States. And you can switch slides, please. Thank you. So this presentation contributes to these bodies of scholarship by situating her activism within the evolution of transnational feminist networks in the late 20th century. And in doing so, this paper reveals a complex story of feminist interaction that included criticism, condemnation, and commendation as El Saadawi challenged feminist stereotypes, both those told about feminists and feminisms, as well as those held by feminists, especially by some feminists living in the global north. Next slide, please. In the years leading up to the Copenhagen conference, El Saadawi had increasingly come into contact with outside perspectives on the Arab world. For instance, in June 1976, she attended an international conference on women and development at Wellesley College in the United States. A group of scholars at Wellesley coordinated the conference, working with a program committee of academics hailing primarily from top-notch universities on the East Coast of the US to bring together women from around the world. The program committee, however, neglected a few key aspects of conference design, and in doing so maintained an imbalance of power, which hindered collaboration across geopolitical and cultural differences. El Saadawi quickly discerned some of the problematic assumptions that underlay the execution of the conference, and she decided to team up with Moroccan feminist Fatima Mernissi and Thai social scientist Malika Bertrand to write an analysis of the conference. And this critique was picked up by a number of feminist publications. One that is shown here, Quest, was published in 1978. Now, the first criticism, and if you can go ahead and click the arrow, so I have bullets that come up, thanks. So the first criticism leveled at the conference was its poor organization in terms of allowing for equal or proportionate participation of women from the Global South as experts. I'm not going to get into details on this point, but basically women from the Global North presented papers to women from the Global South about issues in the Global South. Now, the second criticism, and you can, thanks, leveled at the conference by various observers pointed to the poor analysis on the part of some scholars from the Global North who ignored colonial legacies and contemporary international relations. So one conference participant stated that the, quote, insufficient appreciation of the historical experiences to which women in some of these societies have been subjected, end quote, meant that scholars ignored the consequences of colonial policies that had fundamentally altered the structures of communities and families. And another conference participant argued that development policies and practices too often maintained, quote, systems whereby rich nations continue to underdevelop poor nations by consuming a huge proportion of the world's resources, while multinational corporations grossly underpay third world workers, end quote. For El Saadawi, this kind of injustice should have been central to the conversation at Wellesley, but she found instead that, quote, Western women put the emphasis on the conditions of oppression of women in developing countries. The causes of this oppression become secondary, end quote. And for El Saadawi, many of those causes having to do with colonial legacies and international relations. So the significance of the Wellesley Conference is that it raised El Saadawi's awareness of the problematic framing of conversations on women in development by some experts. She came to understand that it was those with greater access to resources and funding who steered conversations away from what she believed to be the real issues. So always looking for ways to reach new audiences, El Saadawi turned to the UN and to translations of her published works to have her voice heard in new arenas. And both of these measures came with new possibilities, but also with new problems. Next slide, please. So El Saadawi joined the UN in 1978, and during her tenure there, she gradually lost her reverence for international development experts. You can leave it on the blank slide, whom she came to see as pushing a narrative that at best had little to do with the lived reality of most Africans and at worst supported forms of colonialism. Thus, El Saadawi understood that she needed to continue to publish her own analyses of the issues in order to be heard. But El Saadawi faced a conundrum common to women's rights activists from the Global South. That is, because her work brought attention to shortcomings in Arab societies, some political, literary, and religious leaders in Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world decried her and her findings for airing dirty laundry to international audiences and for accepting Western norms in regard to women's societal roles. We've heard about this during the keynote today, too. At the same time, El Saadawi encountered criticism on the part of some feminists from the Global North who questioned her authenticity because she spoke out on what they deemed to be quote unquote political, that is not quote unquote women's issues, when she connected women's problems in the Arab world with colonial legacies or international relations. Thus, El Saadawi faced admonishment within Egypt for bringing attention to women's rights issues and clashed with some in transnational feminist circles for looking beyond Arab culture to explain injustices imposed on women. So for El Saadawi, this challenge came to a head at the UN Second World Conference on Women in Copenhagen in 1980. Two of the issues that El Saadawi spoke about at the conference, Palestinian women's lives and female genital cutting practices, garnered much attention during the conference, and her outspokenness on these issues earned her both condemnation and commendation. Next slide, please. So El Saadawi first worked with Palestinian refugees in Jordan in 1968, and her post at the UN in Beirut again brought her into contact with Palestinian refugees living in camps in Lebanon. More broadly at the UN, she worked with 14 governments in the Middle East, including the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, on issues of women's access to educational, social, and economic resources. Part of her efforts at the UN in Beirut went into drafting a report on the special issues of Palestinian women. Thus, the Copenhagen Conference Secretariat tapped El Saadawi to speak to the journalist encounter in order to provide a synopsis of the study. Her presentation did not go off without a hitch, however, as following it, an Israeli reporter attacked El Saadawi and the UN study, complaining that the Israeli perspective was missing from the report and charging El Saadawi with ignoring injustices perpetrated against women in Arab societies, including female genital cutting and child marriage. A heated exchange ensued. with the moderator eventually taking hold of the situation, and the proceedings continued. But some of the coverage of the disagreement painted El Saadawi as, quote, pro-PLO, anti-Israel, and anti-United States, end quote, in attempts to brush off her statements and damage her credibility. Next slide, please. Now, despite the Israeli journalist's accusation that El Saadawi ignored women's rights abuses within Arab societies, El Saadawi spoke precisely on those issues on a number of occasions during the NGO forum, and had been speaking out on just such issues since her tenure as a rural doctor in the late 1950s. As a village doctor, El Saadawi caused a stir by confronting rituals and practices executed by midwives and village barbers that jeopardized the health of her patients. Some of the common operations performed by these groups of people included unsanitary inoculations, circumcision of both female and male children, and I'm using that term here because that's the term that El Saadawi uses to describe these surgeries, and quote unquote deflorations of brides. Over the following decades, as we've already seen, El Saadawi continued to call out female circumcision and other prevalent customs that she saw as harmful to women, eventually publishing several nonfiction works on women's rights issues as a medical professional in the 1970s, the first of which we heard about in the keynote again, Women and Sex, led to her dismissal from her directorship at the Ministry of Health in 1972. Next slide, please. It should be of no surprise then that El Saadawi did not shrink from speaking out on women's rights violations in the Arab world at the Copenhagen conference. Indeed, at one workshop, just a few days into the NGO forum, El Saadawi gained broad press coverage when she described her own circumcision. Now, in the months and years preceding and succeeding the conference in Copenhagen, feminist periodicals published excerpts from El Saadawi's work, as well as brief reports stemming from others' research on the practices of female genital cutting, bringing an unprecedented awareness of the issue to international audiences. Next slide, please. So One Woman's research gained the attention necessary to launch an international campaign to end such practices. In 1979, American feminist, journalist, and urban planner Fran Hoskin published a 370-page report on what she termed female genital mutilation, FGM, detailing various forms of the practice of female genital cutting in parts of Africa and the Arab world for an international audience. While feminists such as El Saadawi, who had confronted the issue in their home country for decades, may have welcomed Hoskin's support in dismantling systems of oppression that manifested themselves through such practices, Hoskin's approach to the subject thwarted cooperation between feminists from the global South and the global North. Several observers described Hoskin's campaign to end the practice of FGM as a quote-unquote crusade, one which Hoskin seemed to see herself as fighting for, not with, women from societies where female genital cutting was commonly practiced. Indeed, in the foreword to her report, Hoskin claimed that, quote, neither the women who continue today to perform these operations nor the young upon whom these operations are performed know the health damage involved, end quote. And she wrote explicitly about El Saadawi in these terms. That is, Hoskin cited El Saadawi in a chapter about FGM in Egypt. And in Hoskin's concluding remarks about Egypt, she erased any agency on the part of Egyptian women she interviewed, including El Saadawi, by asserting, quote, exposed since childhood to all kinds of myths about their own bodies, socialized to accept male domination in all areas, but especially sexuality, even the women who reject the operations as brutal, never question the institution or the reason why the operations are demanded by men, end quote. Yet, El Saadawi and other medical professionals did know the health consequences of female circumcision, had led educational campaigns in their local areas, and had pushed for change, end quote. Or I mean, next slide, please. So likely in response to Hoskin's report, in the preface to the English edition of The Hidden Face of Eve, which was published in English in 1980, El Saadawi characterized some feminists in the US and Europe as, quote, raising a hue and a cry in defense of the victims of female circumcision, writing long articles and delivering speeches at congresses. Of course, she clarifies, it is good that female circumcision be denounced, but by concentrating on such manifestations, there is a risk that the real issues of social and economic change may be evaded or even forgotten. I oppose all attempts to deal with such problems in isolation, she declared. Specifically, El Saadawi wanted to place the conversation on female genital cutting practices within a larger discussion on imperialism, capitalism, and patriarchy. Hoskin and a number of other feminists in the global North wrote off such arguments on the part of El Saadawi and other feminists in the global South as quote unquote male politics, frequently portraying women from the global South as dupes of male political leaders. Fran Hoskin also explicitly attacked El Saadawi in print and in private correspondence in the 1980s, repeatedly referring to her as, quote, a PLO spokesperson, end quote, and a, quote, tool of the PLO, end quote, a portrayal meant to bring into question El Saadawi's integrity. Next slide, please. So plenty of studies have shown that women from decolonizing nations are often put in the impossible situation of being both upholders of tradition and signifiers of their society's modernity, and that women who speak out against societal traditions are labeled inauthentic dissidents by political and religious leaders. Thus, El Saadawi's difficulties in her home country should be of no surprise. What we learned from El Saadawi's story here is that when she turned to the international realm at the Copenhagen conference and on the issue of FGM, her authenticity was also challenged by some global North feminists who claim that her political views, that is her advocacy on behalf of Palestinian refugees, eliminated her ability to speak out on Arab and African women's rights. Yet her beliefs in regard to Arab and African women's rights stem directly from her lived experiences as an Egyptian woman, a rural doctor, a UN advisor, and a practicing psychologist. Further, her forthrightness captivated many audiences. Thus, this is also not a simple story of imperial feminism in toto. That is, not all global North feminists condemned El Saadawi. She became a celebrated voice and remained, quote, consistently in demand, end quote, up until her death last year. Challenging stereotypes about feminists and feminisms, including assumptions about what feminists believe and where feminists came from, as well as stereotypes held by feminists, including which issues were women's issues. El Saadawi spoke across geopolitical borders and called attention to the political, social, and historical complexity of women's situations. By doing so, she won distinction as she forwarded her own vision of solidarity and transnational feminism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Excellent presentation, and thank you for staying on time. And I really, really look forward to discussing your amazing paper. I have so many questions and points for you because I am honestly fascinated by your research and I can't wait to read your book. Thank you so much. Next, we have Professor Carspecken, Lucinda, if I may, please.
So real and imagined lives. I dreamt of another world on Earth and in the heavens. It was as though I had come into the world from an unknown planet, could not believe that the Earth and the heavens were two separate things, would not believe in a country which robbed me of my pride and freedom, in a husband who did not treat me as an equal, and a God who made me only half a human being. Nawal El Saadawi's acts of rebellion began early. Her mother taught her to write her name, Nawal, which means a gift. She enjoyed putting her mother's name, Zaynab, next to it and looking at the two words together. But her father replaced his second name with his own. When she asked him why, he answered that it was God's will. He had also told her that God was just. So she wrote a letter asking, "Oh God, if you are just, why do you treat my mother and my father differently?" She continued with acts of rebellion throughout her childhood. At festival time, her grandmother distributed money to the children. Each boy got 2 coins, while each girl received only 1. Because in God's eyes, the old lady said, a girl is worth half a boy. In protest, El Saadawi tossed hers back into her grandmother's lap. Her parents and grandmother were rebels themselves. Her father was a school inspector who had fought for the Egyptian independence in 1919. British troops remained in the Suez Canal, however, and in the 1930s, he marched with a group of students against this occupation in defiance of their principal. Their principal reported him to the government. El Saadawi's father responded, "You might as well empty the ink pot on your report, Mr. Headmaster." El Saadawi's mother had a lot of pride too, and the only time her husband raised his voice to her in anger, she threatened to leave. "I'm ready to go from house to house washing clothes rather than live with a man who shouts at me," she told him. And El Saadawi's grandmother was a fearless peasant woman. When her 2-year-old son came home with a bloody nose after being beaten by the chief of the village guard, she went to find the man and then struck him hard in the face, announcing, "The one who can beat my son has not yet been created."
Lucinda, just really quickly, I'm going to share my screen just because your whole computer is open and I just think it would just look a little better for the audience. So if you want to stop sharing, or I'll just share your slides for you, and we'll go through them that way.
Okay.
Thank you.
Al Saadawi loved these stories and internalized them. As a schoolgirl and later as a student, she joined demonstrations propelled by a childhood image of herself, sword in hand, fighting for her country's freedom. So can we go down one more? Thank you. Al Saadawi wrote 3 memoirs over 19 years. Memoir from the Women's Prison describes the months she spent as a political prisoner in 1981 and was published in 1983. A Daughter of ISIS was written during a stay at Duke University in 1993, when she had fled Cairo after receiving death threats. It covers the period from her birth up until her medical studies. She published Walking Through Fire in 2002, and it describes her 3 marriages and her years as a doctor, author, and activist. I'll take 2 different pairs of narratives from Al Saadawi's memoirs to illustrate how she weaves between reality and imagination, reason and emotion. The first pair comes from A Daughter of ISIS. The story of the singing man and the story of the suitor contrast an early experience of love with her meeting with a prospective husband. The second pair, The Gecko and the Messenger, is from Memoir from the Women's Prison and contrasts an emotional high point with a period of despair. So, new slide, please. The singing man and the suitor. When Al Saadawi is 10 years old, she hears a young man singing and playing the lute above her family's apartment. She wonders, is it a voice descending from the heavens? No, it comes from the balcony above me, but it's not like any other voice. It's unique, caresses my ear, flows down my neck, to my breast, to my belly, continues down as far as my feet, then rises up again to my heart or my head. It sings for me, for no one else. Every morning she listens to his songs. She never speaks of him, but even to hear one of the letters of his name makes her tremble, makes her voice flame, her face flame. One day she meets him in the middle of a field and is struck by the brightness of his eyes. Another day she sees him passing by her window. She prefers, though, to spend time with him in fantasy, where he's surrounded by green with his white shirt billowing around him. New slide, please. Shortly after this experience, when she's still 10 years old, her family brings a suitor to the house. He's well-to-do, and they believe he'll make a good husband. She, though, is repelled by his sunken posture and his small, beady eyes. She spends the night before his visit pondering ways to escape, even thinking of suicide. Eventually, she comes up with a plan. Under the coat stand outside the parlor, she hides an eggplant. Just before going in to greet him, she bites into it and smears the skin over her teeth. After all the efforts her relatives have made, straightening her hair, waxing her arms, rouging her cheeks, she gives the potential bridegroom a black-toothed smile. Then she trips over her high heels and spills coffee onto him. Al Saadawi places these stories one after the other, highlighting the contrast. The prospective husband, with the spittle at the corners of his mouth and his narrow eyes looking at her breasts, is juxtaposed with the bright-eyed man who infuses her dreams. New slide, please. The Gecko and the Messenger. At the age of 50, Al Saadawi spends her first night in prison. She finds a thin rubber mattress on the floor of the crowded cell. It smells of urine, and she tries to sleep with her head as far away from the stench as possible. Voices shriek in a nearby room. It's hot. She's plastered in sweat, and a red electric light glares in her eyes even through closed lids. Cockroaches and rats run around the walls and floors. She glimpses a gecko crossing the ceiling above her and is filled with fear. She remembers her grandmother's belief that geckos carry leprosy. She has the feeling that if she looks at it, it will fall onto her. She opens an eye. The gecko falls. It lands on her leg and then scrambles away. At this point, she makes a shift. My eyes widened in amazement, and suddenly incomprehensible feelings of happiness engulfed me. I closed my single eye in peace and slept until morning. To this moment, I do not know how I slept, and I don't know the secret of that repose, or the happiness that came all over me all of a sudden. Perhaps it was the gecko which had taken fright of me rather than the other way around. Or perhaps it was the happiness of self-discovery, where there appears before one's eyes a new courage or self-confidence of which one was previously unaware, or when one disperses a fear or phantom with which one has been living. I had been living according to a bizarre illusion or an irrational fear of the gecko. The gecko had crawled over my body and nothing had happened to me. Cockroaches had run over me and nothing had happened. I had lived with a fear of these small, innocent beings that moved with a marvelous grace in the night. These creatures danced around me, causing me no harm. New slide. El Saadawi's lowest emotional point in the jail comes after she has entrusted a woman called Fatia the murderess with a message for her husband, Sheriff. Fatia is in prison because she has killed her own husband for raping their 9-year-old daughter. El Saadawi sees parallels between Fatia's act and her own writing. My hand as it grips the pen, she says, is like her hand when she took hold of the hoe and struck the blow. El Saadawi chooses Fatia as the messenger because she has faith in her and faith in her own feelings about her. But time goes by with no response from Sheriff, and she begins to doubt her own judgment. Perhaps Fatia is a spy, as one of the other prisoners tells her. This is the only time in prison when she sinks into despair. Doubt is the most certain of tortures, she says. Then Fatia hands her a return message, and El Saadawi's buoyancy comes back. El Saadawi writes that she's eager for direct knowledge. Her first night in jail is a new experience, and she's also able to free herself of an illusion. Discovery brings joy. Doubt in her own perceptions brings despair. New slide, please. There are several places in the memoirs where she connects feeling and reason. Here's an example from Memoirs from the Women's Prison. I don't distinguish between intellect and feelings. Sound feelings mean a sound mind. Sometimes the intellect errs, knowing only numbers and the circumscribed logical thinking which we inherit and to which we become accustomed. But sound feelings represent the more profound mind, that which comprises human sentiment, emotional feelings, perception and discernment, and the accumulation of knowledge and experience. When she looks back on her childhood, she expresses the kind of clear-eyed reason that children use, in the letter to God, for example. As an adult, she's equally clear-eyed about the inconsistencies of the powerful. Sadat has jailed El Saadawi, she says, because I took him at his word when he spoke of democracy. She frequently quotes her father and grandmother, who say that God is justice and is known through reason. El Saadawi has inherited this tendency to follow her own conception of religion. She looks for coherence and justice within the Arabo-Islamic tradition, rather than critiquing it from the outside. Along with reason, joy and laughter are important to her. She describes the particular tones of laughter among people she admires, like signatures. Her mother's laugh is like the ring of sweet, limpid water in a vessel of pure silver or crystal. Her grandmother has a strange, jerky, gasping, muffled laughter, almost like sobbing. Her friend Bata has a laugh that sounds like water pouring out of the neck of a narrow-necked earthenware jar. In the prison, the women often laugh. When El Saadawi comes back from the Ministry of Justice and describes the farcical inefficiency there, we laughed until we almost passed out. Religious and political zealots in her texts never laugh. El Saadawi takes joy and laughter as positive indicators. Joy is sound feeling. New slide, please. In contrast, illusions and myths propagated by powerful others provoke pain and anger. As a child, she realizes that the world values males, not females. This fact, she said, ran through my body like a shiver of cold, a dark shiver, as murky as death. It motivates her to write. Maybe I wanted to draw a true image of myself and make the world see it, bring back the image which had been obscured by another image, make the silent child hidden in my depths speak up. My body was able to feel the shiver creep up, able to understand the silence in the eyes, to see the words staring out. I wanted to get hold of something sharp like scissors or a razor blade or a pen, plunge it into those eyes, open them. To me, the world seemed a magic world. It was unreal. Behind the magic world hid the real one, and I had to find it. Perhaps the whole of my life has been the search for the real, hidden behind what was false. Was it my eyes that couldn't see, or was it people around me describing things in a way which was unreal, including the self which was me? The narratives of the gecko and the messenger illustrate al Saadawi's association of discovery with joy, doubt and illusion with pain. And at times, this leads her to reverse what most people consider to be real or unreal. New slide, please. The stories of the gecko, the messenger, the suitor, and the singing man incorporate 4 ways of knowing in al Saadawi's memoirs: cognitive discovery, emotion, sensory experience, and imagination. Each of these nourishes her rebelliousness. First, she calls out inconsistency, questions myths, and is thirsty for knowledge. Second, she trusts her feelings and questions doctrines that undermine her happiness. Third, she describes the sensory experiences of poorer women and men in Egypt, work and sweat in the fields, the taste of bread, cheese, and pickles. And fourth, she maintains a vision of the way the world should be alongside the way it is. She moves easily between these modes and gives the impression that one is as real and vital as another. New slide, please. The final pages of al Saadawi's final memory describe a chance encounter when she's in her 60s. She's on the return flight from North Carolina to Egypt. She notices a handsome man in the seat beside her. He asks if she's a movie star and tells her that she looks like Sophia Loren. She says he looks like Gregory Peck. She describes his particular laugh, a childish, gurgling laugh. They discuss politics and life while the other passengers drop off to sleep. She writes, "We went on in this seemingly endless dialogue, I myself fired by an ineffable and powerful joy which flowed through my whole body from the top of my head to the tips of my toes, a joy which I had hardly known since I was 10 years old. Through the window I could glimpse the dark steel wing of the plane cutting through the white clouds as they floated in space, like a scene from a film I was watching and living at the same time. I was the woman in it, living this chance encounter, suspended between heaven and earth." She's laid over in London and they keep talking. About 10 hours into the conversation, they exchange names, which have not seemed important before. Then she travels on to Cairo and is happy to return to her family. This scene fulfills several of al Saadawi's dreams. She's living out her childhood fantasy of flying. She's returning to Egypt, the land she loves and hopes to change. She's talking to a man as an equal and making a profound connection. She holds on to the possibility for equality and love between men and women, just as she holds on to her faith in other forms of justice. Her imagination is key to her courage. I find it wonderful that she ends on this note, with this brief and joyous encounter. For all her willingness to look at pain, she's a dreamer through and through.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carspecken, Lucinda, for such an engaging presentation. Okay, thank you so much for all 3 of our panelists, and I really enjoyed all your presentations, which really provoked so much to talk about that I will try to limit myself. I'll start by maybe outlining some of the common themes I feel that I had seen or heard right now, both noticed when I was reading your longer papers, as well as like listening now to your presentations. There are 3 threads that we can distinguish here that runs through the 3 presentations / 3 papers. The first thread is really the way in which new readings of Nawal's both activism and writings had been the often sort of dichotomies or the often stereotypes we tend to put at Nawal's writing and work, and which the 3 presentations I think are trying to challenge and force us to do a sort of a more deeper, I would say, complex reading of not only of her writings, both fiction and nonfiction, autobiography, as Dr. Carspecken had shown us, or in her novels, as Mohamed Tonsy had shown us, or even in the way we tend to think about her international activism and the reception of her activism and of her writing, both in Egypt and abroad, as Dr. Frazier or Professor Frazier or Jessica, if she allows me, had shown us. I think the three presentations or papers are showing us new ways of reading Nawal El Saadawi's written work, but also her activism or her, I would say, life written work, because I think she was very adamant throughout her life of not distinguishing between the both and between the two of those and thinking that they were closely interlinked. So with that thread, I would say that Mohamed Tonsy, or if I just say Mohammed or Mr. without any alqab, as we say in Egypt, without any Mohammed. Great. Mohammed is doing a great job of highlighting something that's often missed in literary critiques of Nawal Saadawi's work, and feminist literary critiques in particular, which is that of the use of what he calls the narrative units and the linguistic units, and how they interact together to produce silences. And those silences are intentional. They are often intentional. I have to confess something, that in Egypt, and I have heard that a lot, and we have Professor Cooke with us here and Shereen, both literary professors. I'm not a literary person, but I have often heard that being said, that Nawal's literary body of work is not as strong as her feminist writing nonfiction. I've heard this being said over and over again by so many people, right? And I think what your presentation does is kind of like show us that this is not exactly the case, and that all these silences that are implicit within Saadawi's work are actually literary strategies. They are strategies that are being intentionally used. They are not just for a lack of, literary training, or they are not for a lack of something. And it is actually what you call the negative space that Zakiya, her main protagonist, occupies, that we can see those silences and those narrative silences as they speak. I would love to hear more from you, as well as from Dr. Abouelnaga and Dr. Cooke about this later, but I feel that this is a really new reading of her fictional work that is very, very interesting and important. Same goes to Dr. Carspecken, who is showing us how emotions and intellect are something that seem to be intertwined, inseparable in Saadawi's work and in her writing. And this comes across very much in your very insightful reading of her memoirs. There is the fear of the gecko, a creature that had appeared in all our lives as children, I think, in Egypt, and how she is really expressing her fear of the gecko in ways that are emotive, not only emotive, but also telling perhaps other fears she's facing as a young woman at that time. And how, for her activism, her life, her writing, and her emotions are all subjects of one thing, are something that's inseparable. So this idea of thinking about Nawal's life work, whether in the writing or in her especially in her memoirs, as a critique of the separation of the mind and the emotion, I think it's something that is very important and that feminist writers have expressed a lot. But it's very clear that Nawal is doing that, and it's doing that very early on. And she comes to, and she's expressing this in her memoirs as she comes of age, in a way, especially in her last memoir, Walking on Through Fire, where she is kind of coming to terms with thinking about how her own personal life and her marriages had influenced the way her thinking had been. So this kind of emotions and writing and ideas are very important, I think is a great contribution in our rereading of her memoirs in particular, and how we tend to think of it. Dr. Frazier's amazing reading of Nawal El Saadawi's reception in the West and in the East is really kind of like fascinating to me. There is an emerging body of literature that is kind of talking about this kind of transnational feminist activists, whether it's possible at all, right? I happen to be reading a book that kind of reminds me a lot about your presentation right now, and I'm sure you have heard of it, which is Kate Mallet, Whisper Tapes, Kate Mallet in Iran by Nejar Motahadi. It just came out of Stanford University Press last year. And she's talking about Kate Mallet's very famous visit to Iran during, in the early days of the 1979 revolution, right? And in it, she is kind of, in through exposing these, what she calls whisper tapes, or these tapes that had been unearthed after 40 years of conversations between Kate Mallet and the lost in translation moments, right? Between feminists in the West and feminists, Middle Eastern feminists and other feminists. I think what Dr. Frazier had led us to, and this is coming really most beautifully in her paper, is the limitations of this encounter, but also its possibilities, correct? Like there's a lot of possibilities in these encounters that you point to, and possibilities for both sides, right? So no matter, even when you are talking about all the misunderstandings and the sometimes outright racialized reading of, you know, Middle Eastern women's writings and activism, Hoskin report, like calling like Saadawi being the mouthpiece of the PLO, Saadawi being received as this woman, as this feminist who doesn't really know, who's kind of like being misled by men, by Arab men. They are using her to promote their own ideas. And then also the way she used in return the international exposure that she gained to sort of, you know, create a different narrative, create her own narrative of what's going on about women's rights in the Middle East, but also her own narrative about the West. And so this exchange is really fascinating, and I would love it if you can expand a little bit about the limitations and the and of those. So the first thread is all these like really new readings of her life and work. The second thing that I can see is the and I promise I'll be very brief, is the mistranslation or the lost in translation moments, right? I was struck when I was listening to your presentation, Mohamed, and please correct me if I'm wrong. But the translation of the book that you're talking about is kind of different from the Arabic translation, correct? And I was always wondering about the politics of these translations, right? I think, Jessica, you talk about this a little bit in your paper as well, but there had been a lot of editorial decisions done by those who translate Nawal's book. It's not going to be it's going to be the death of God, or the hidden face of Eve, rather than al-wajh al-airi lil-mar'a al-arabiyya, which literally translates to the naked face of the Arab women, correct? Or the unhidden face of the Arab women, or something like that. So it's really kind of interesting what role do these translations play? And I wonder if Professor Carspecken can say something about this also in the translation of Nawal's memoirs, and how this translation had like, there was a politics of translation that I found here very interesting, that speaks also directly to Professor Frazier's presentation about, of course, the limitations and the opportunities of transnational feminist solidarity, correct? Third is really the ways in which Nawal El Saadawi's work had often been embroiled in as we heard from Dr. Shereen's earlier in the day, in larger contexts of socioeconomic, political struggles, whether on the local level in Egypt or in the Arab world, or also on the global level. So in Mohamed's presentation, we hear a lot about the inspector, the power, right? The assault on women's bodies is part of a larger context of injustice, of assault on human dignity, right? In your story. In the memoirs, there is a very clear message of humanist, as maybe somebody else called it earlier today, this humanistic perspective. Especially, I was struck by Dr. Carspecken's presentation when she talks about Nawal's encounter with the guy that she talks to, with this man, whom she exchanges like a very human, open exchange with him, and she feels like this common humanity, right? And she describes this as one of the best moments of her life, right? Because she's returning to Egypt, yet she has this human interaction with people, which kind of, I think, in the subtext, it speaks to how much she missed this human interaction in Egypt, because she was often maligned and often seen as something that she's not, right? So she's celebrating this simple human encounter so much. And also kind of like of course, in your presentation, Dr. Frazier, there's also this idea of the common, how, of course, we see all these politics collapse and collide together, right? Nawal having to prove to her Arab Egyptian audience that she is this pan-Arabist, socialist, feminist, which she was. Like, she wasn't denying that she was like that, but she always have to prove her credentials more than a lot of her contemporaries, correct? And at the same time, she has to prove to the West that she's not an agent of the PLO. And I love the way you write about this in your paper. You're saying that was actually her politics. I'm not denying that her politics, but her politics were being used against her for a Western audience that's kind of like to just embroil her within this larger Arab-Israeli conflict, which of course she had like very pro-Palestinian stances in it, naturally. But I love the way you are bringing how this was embroiled in kind of like, she was often embroiled in bigger struggles. And that also presents an opportunity, but it also presents a way of misunderstanding her, or a gateway for all these misunderstandings and all of that. So with these three threads, I will stop here. But I would love to hear more about, if any of you want to elaborate more on these threads. And but I'll stop here and maybe see if we have questions. If we don't have any written questions, we can also start taking questions from our other fellow panelists or other people. So any other questions before I give the floor to our panelists? Any other comments, questions, other than mine at this point? Okay, so why don't we go this time with the reverse order? So we will start with Dr. Carspecken, Professor Carspecken.
Am I looking for? Should I answer a question?
Yeah. Answer, comment, do whatever you want with my few sentences.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I in the muddle of my screen share problems, I forgot to thank the wonderful papers that have gone before and the organizers also. But I really have appreciated all the papers today. And I feel very inadequate actually to answer your question about translation, because I don't know. Because I felt like the language was often so beautiful in these memoirs, and they were also my introduction to Nawal's work. I came to her late in life, and I came through the memoirs rather than through the novels. And yeah, so I because I don't know Arabic, I don't know how they were changed, and so I feel very inadequate to answer that question actually.
What about the mix of the intellect and the emotions? And
yeah, I thought you expressed that beautifully. What impresses me about her is her ability to sort of, her amazing fluidity. Like, she'll go from past to present, from a fantasy to something very sensory and very gritty, from thought to feeling. And she has such a, I mean, she's like a ballerina going from one to the other. So it's quite dizzying to read. Yeah, it just struck me because, and I don't know how I think she is very conscious of that too, because of those explicit things she says about feeling and thought. I find her exemplary for that reason, for her fluidity and her sort of self-consciousness about these different modes of being. Does that answer your question?
Of course.
Okay.
So yeah, we can move to Jessica. Any comments, answers on anything?
I wonder if I can quickly comment. Just to echo what Hind has just said, 3 wonderful provocative papers and in terrific listing of the points. But I thought that maybe since, Lucinda, you say that you have not had access to quite a lot of Nawal's work, that I could just briefly talk about a short story that she wrote back in the late 80s called Eyes. And it's the acting out, the performance of exactly what you were talking about, this move between reality and fantasy. And because of the way in which you talked about her conversation on the plane, and was it a real conversation, and how was she connecting it to her childhood? Fascinating here, it's the story of a young woman, totally covered, so niqab, so that's a face cover as well, who works in a museum, and she works in the basement. And she's absolutely terrified of everything, particularly her father. But basically, she's not in touch with anyone. And so her work there is to make an inventory of things in the museum. And one thing that she has to inventory is a tiny statue of an ancient Egyptian god. She becomes totally fascinated by this item. And he develops from being a little god that she pops into her bag and takes home with her. He becomes real. And she's very frightened because it seems that this god, that for whom she now has a statue, was killed in a flood thousands of years ago. And it could be that he's satanic. Anyway, she can't let go of him. And as always, as all of you have been saying, it's all about the eyes. So we all, those of us who knew Nawal know that her eyes were like coal, you know, black and intense, and part of her charisma, why almost every time that she gave a talk, she had a standing ovation. It was quite remarkable. So anyway, she's really focused on this statue's eyes. And he becomes so real for her that she sees him on her way to the museum. She sees him in the street and she's like, oh my God, that's him. And she comes, here's this fully covered woman. She comes rushing up to this man and she puts her arms around him, and he turns on her and he's like, oh my God, you're crazy. Well, of course, it does turn her crazy. And so Nawal does, at the end of this short story, what she does at Woman M.0, she pretty much ends up with saying, and that's how she came to me.
I see. Lovely story. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got to read that one. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Miriam, as usual. So, Jessica, do you want to comment?
Sure. Yeah, so there were a couple of points. Thank you, Hind, for your comments too. That they made me think of quite a few points, some of them coming from something that came out of the keynote speech earlier, where we're talking about trying to push people in Egypt in particular, trying to push Nawal El Saadawi back into this like limited space when she's speaking out on these issues that people just don't want her talking about. And seeing her as someone who speaks to a Western audience, and of course I know what my paper says while I'm listening to this, so I already know that she does speak to some members of a Western audience quite readily, but others are stereotyping her and wanting her to fit into the stereotype of the Arab woman that she does not fit into. And so they're also, as I was listening to that about these Egyptians leaders trying to push her into this box, that's exactly, I think, what's happening in my paper that we see too, where these global North feminists are also trying to put her into this box of this Arab woman, and she is refusing to be put in that box. And part of that, I think too, something else that you mentioned, Hind, in your comments, was about the limits and the possibilities of the transnational, and the limits and the possibilities of the translations of her works and how they can play out in the transnational and international conversations. And I think that speaks to that, where there are people who want to see the Arab world in a particular way, and particularly Arab women in a particular way. And she very much pushes against that. And she also is, as we've talked about, an anti-imperialist. And so she's rewriting what the West is as an imperialist, as multiple different imperialist nations, and what that means in the history of Egypt in particular. And so this is what is part of the conflict that happens at the Copenhagen conference. One other part of the larger context that I wanted to bring attention to was that Nawal El Saadawi was not the only person who was treated in this way when it comes to women or feminists from the global South during the UN decade, that there was kind of a assumed hierarchy of feminists and feminisms. And I think that still in some circles exists today, that there's still an assumed hierarchy of feminists and feminisms. And this is also part of what I'm trying to get at, is where we assume feminism comes from and who we assume feminists can be, and where feminisms come from. Then, she's being charged as being westernized by being feminist. But feminists from the global North also assume that. They assume that they're the ones who bring feminism. And that's what I enjoyed the Dr. Carspecken's talk, where she talks about kind of El Saadawi's childhood, and she has this very early gendered consciousness. And we could call her an organic intellectual. She's definitely coming from a homegrown feminist perspective. She is not learning feminism from outside of her own space, right? She had develops her own feminism in her own gendered consciousness. But within the larger context of the UN decade, and especially at the Copenhagen conference, there was this major conflict about whether feminism was political, what women's issues were, and whether they were political, and who got to decide what they were. And it was this whole mess of conversation that later on in the decade, it starts to get cleared up. But as I said, even today, there are these, I suppose, discussions, conflicts within feminist circles. So those were some of the things that were kind of popping around in my head, given the common themes that you saw in these papers. So thank you for your comments.
No, thank you so much, Jessica. And if I can follow this up with another very quick question / comment. And we have a question also in the Q&A that sort of speaks to this. I wonder if any of the speakers can shed some light on how Nawal's feminism had evolved over her long journey. I think part of what you just talked about, Jessica, or Professor Frazier, whatever you want me, whatever you prepare, is honestly this idea of evolvement. Like Nawal's feminism, she was consistent in so many things, right? She was consistent of being an anti-imperialist, always calling herself a socialist, leftist feminist, always kind of linking this kind of intersectionality. But her feminism also evolves, right? And evolves in ways that are very interesting. And I think this encounter is important in how she evolves and how she gets to think of herself, and how she, going back to the other theme, thinks about these, the interlinkage between the mind, body, the intellect, the the emotive, all of these things. I think Nawal, one of her really enduring legacies is that she was an emotional woman who wasn't scared of being called an emotional woman, if that makes any sense to those who are listening to me. And she thought that this was actually something that expressed the condition of women in ways that we don't talk about or write about. And I think she was one of the earliest people to get at that word globally, honestly. So that and that kind of makes her such an enduring and important figure. Before we leave the thing, I mean, my very quick question to you about that is like, if you want to comment on this, how feminism evolved, how her feminism evolved as a result of this encounter, but also kind of like, I think the Wellesley moment that you describe in your presentation and in your, it's such a watershed moment for me. Like I hadn't read that much about it. I heard about it, but and I confess I was reading your paper over the last couple of days with fascination, because it seems to me that it was one of these earliest encounters in which that happened, and it also happened within an academic circle. So as you mentioned, like the UN Decade for Women, starting from the 70s, like the activist circles becomes this, battlefield on defining what women's rights are, correct? Legally and in UN documents and in policies and all of these things. But the Wellesley moment is a moment where academics are debating that, correct? So it's really interesting to me about, if you can speak a little bit about the context of this particular moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the major points of what's coming out of the Wellesley conference is this questioning of who is an expert, and is particularly who is an expert on women's issues and who is an expert on women's issues in the global South. And it, the conference, again, it was specifically about women in development, and it was hosted by women in the global North in the United States, largely for women in the global South. And I didn't talk about this in the paper in my presentation, but I do talk about it in the written paper. And so there were about 500 attendees, and there were only 80 people who presented. And Nawal El Saadawi did not present at this conference. And she has this comment she makes, it was in the early 1980s in an interview, where she comments about how she was sitting in the audience listening to an American woman speak about Egypt, her home country, and she learns later that the woman had spent 3 months in Egypt, and there she is teaching and preaching about Egypt. This is like, I'm more or less quoting her. And I can just feel her frustration in that, and especially also in terms of the way that the conference was set up. A lot of the presenters went over time. There was no Q&A period, and a lot of these types of conferences that people aren't allowed to interrupt papers. And there were discussions between the participants and the organizers about like, but these women are giving false information about our home countries, and we're not allowed to interrupt. And so it was very much, and again, this is very much dynamic about who is allowed to be an expert, who is an expert in this hierarchy of assumptions about women from the West, women from the global North are the experts.
If I can interrupt for a minute, I was really struck by this part of your paper because you mentioned that both Saadawi and Marnisi were in attendance, and they were not given the floor to talk. I'm like, seriously, like the two most important, okay, let's
very
let go
important.
of very prominent. Let's get rid of superlatives like most, but two of the most prominent, feminist thinkers in the region, and they are not given the floor to speak.
Yeah, Marnisi actually did get to talk, so she at least did. But yeah, El Saadawi didn't. And like I said, there were hundreds of women from the global South invited, and they were not allowed to speak. They were not given the floor. Now there was a workshop following the conference in which then they kind of hashed out some of these issues, started to think about, and El Saadawi attended that, as well as a number of other women from the global South attended. It was about 30 or 50 participants that stayed to talk about those issues. But yeah, I mean, it really very much speaks to this moment of, I think, international feminism, global feminism, transnational feminism, depending on which term you want to use to describe that. And this idea, and this is in a moment when women from the United States and Europe are trying to push for this global sisterhood. And then that kind of gets squashed in the 1980s, and there is no global sisterhood, especially because we have hierarchies that you are ignoring. And al-Saadawi is very much part of that conversation. And I think going into the question that is in the chat, I think that's part of her evolution is happening in the 1970s when she is confronting these issues. She did attend a women's conference for the Women's International Democratic Federation in 1969, and she had a completely different experience there. And so she was expecting to have something that seemed more positive. And the Women's International Democratic Federation was tied to the Soviet Union. And so there was a different, it was anti-colonial and anti-imperialist. And so there was a different political dynamic there. And so when she comes into this context where imperialism is being ignored, that's where she kind of has these clashes, so.
Thank you so much. I'll give the floor to Mohamed, but before that, there is a very interesting question that popped up in the chat right now about intersectionality and what it means, and about some of Nawal's earlier comments writing about lesbianism, LGBTQI, and how some people had read that she's kind of like anti that, or she doesn't want to mix LGBTQI plus struggles with feminism, which is a point that comes also as a point of critique, as an inner point of critique from feminist and progressive circles on Nawal. There was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Cooke, there was an article by Nadine Neber that discussed the same issue a few years back. Nadine Neber is a professor at Illinois University. So maybe we can give the floor to Mohamed, and then maybe if we want to go back to this question, I would love to hear more from the panelists and everyone.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Hind, for kind of like the very nice comments, and thank you all for your incredible essays and presentations. It has been very enlightening. But yeah, so I think first question I guess I'll go for is limits and possibilities of translation. So I'll admit that I actually kind of have only read Rhode, the circling song in Arabic, just because I kind of wanted to, yeah. The English translation kind of like sounded a bit off to my ear, and I kind of wanted to just see the original Arabic. And I noticed, I guess, a tendency to try to almost make the language much more precise in quite a curious way, and which very much kind of like made the resultant kind of like English translation align Saadawi along kind of like different politics. I mean, kind of like her socialism was very much kind of like watered down, and kind of like she was seen as a liberal individualist, which is kind of like very much not the case. But this is kind of, and her anti-imperialism essentially was pretty much eliminated because obviously kind of like, I think at times it was genuinely kind of like almost like a, as kind of like the question is asking from Afif, it's very much sometimes was like a marketing thing that American readers don't want to read about anti-imperialism. So let's tone that down.
I wish to thank Afif for the comment, because I think it's really about marketing as well. It's really about marketing her books to an American readership. But yeah, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but otherwise, I think I went into this reading of Saadawi through this analytical lens, very much to almost kind of like try to break up a sense of that binary between the here and there, because like I think for such a long time, as like some of the other panelists and as has kind of been pointed out, like in the beginning of her life, it was almost like she was trying to. She was kind of like working in feminist circles in Egypt, and then she kind of like got accepted by Western mainstream, and then almost had to work back to kind of like earn her credentials back in Egypt. And by trying to extend the boundaries of kind of like actually what the words do on the page and kind of like reading it in that sense, I hope to break up that dichotomy So that's neither kind of like here or there. We're not focused on kind of like that, but we start to approach kind of like what Jessica was saying, that transnational feminist just approach it as a transnational feminist struggle rather than, separate camps. And just kind of like silences, obviously silences are very much an integral part of Nawal El Saadawi's writing. And there's a lot more kind of like that I didn't go into when it comes to موت الرجل الوحيد على الأرض, which is like all of the hallucinations kind of like that keep repeating, and it's very kind of like very tangible and very visceral. And Nawal's work was always kind of like very much kind of like rooted in embodiment and putting the readers through the motions as well. That's kind of like what was said before, that the feminism wasn't learned, it was experienced. And then it kind of like just developed into something else. And yeah, the collision of politics and her writing and her feminism. So this was an interesting thing when it comes to God Dies by the Nile, because at the very end, I had kind of in that part where the mayor was coercing Zaynab, it almost felt like Nawal El Saadawi had kind of like put the reader into a position where they had to accept that this was what was happening. And obviously kind of like as a reader, I kind of like felt this utmost rejection of the fact that this horrific thing was happening, and I almost kind of like had no way out of it. And just thinking back on some of the criticism that was leveled at her work, that when read by US students, it sometimes does kind of like reinforce prejudices that they might have about Arab feminism, about Arab women. That it's kind of like, it's almost like it as if they try to place some sort of glass ceiling on top of it. But in this case, I think it was like my response to it was a bit different, but it seemed almost more like a challenge. It seemed almost more like a challenge of kind of like, okay, so given that this is the situation, what will we actually do about it? How will we change? And I think kind of like a part of it, we need to start by breaking down those kind of like binaries of the here and there, and start kind of like, communicating with each other. And so in terms of the collision of the politics, I see that she has been read widely in that sense. It doesn't have to be that way. There are other methods of kind of like approaching her work that do not just kind of like have to put her as either kind of like strictly Egyptian or strictly a Western feminist.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very insight, I think.
Yeah.
I think Shereen had oh, I'm sorry, you're still.
Sorry. No, I was just going to ask if there was actually kind of like anything else that I hadn't addressed. But sorry, no, Dr. Shereen.
No, not that I could think of, but please go ahead if you still have something to say. I don't want to be interrupting you.
Oh, no, not at all.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Shereen.
I think this insight, the last insight you mentioned, was really very, very important and useful. And I think we need to chew on it a little bit before tomorrow when we have an entire panel on her literary, reading her literary works. So Shereen?
Yeah, this is a lot of food for thought. Thinking of food, huh? Okay. Now, quickly, when it comes to translation, it's not only about the audience and the market, but also about translation itself, the cultural translation. Because if you translate الوجه العاري للمرأة العربية, like the naked face of the Arab woman, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense actually in English. But when you say the hidden face of Eve, then that makes sense for the reader. Otherwise, you need to paraphrase the title, and this happens with many writers. So, for example, with Hanan al-Sheikh, she has this novel that is called Misk al-Ghazal, and then that was translated into Women of Misk and Myrrh. So it happens all the time. And by the way, vice versa as well. So Salman Rushdie has his novel, The Last Moose Sigh, and in Arabic it was translated as Nafas al-Muslim al-Akhir. So when I read that title, I said, oh my God, and then what happened after that last breath? See, while actually the accurate translation is Zafrat al-Arabiya. So when it comes to translation, it's very complicated, not only because of the market, but also because of the cultural reception of the phrasings. Now, the other thing about the comment in the Q&A about the intersectionality of Saadawi and her comment or position vis-a-vis LGBTQ1. You know, Nawal El Saadawi is, and this is not news for you all, she is a very prolific writer. She wrote fiction and nonfiction. Now, here is the rule. If you really want to know what is missing, go to the fiction. Just go to the fiction and you will fill all the gaps. Nawal El Saadawi wrote extensively about her position, for example, about or towards LGBTQ1 in her novel that is entitled The Novel. There she is, extensively and in detail. So all the gaps can be filled if you go to the fiction. After all, at the end of the day, you can say, this is an imaginary world. Actually, this is not an imaginary world. And your comment, Hind, about how you get the impression that her fictional writings are not as strong as her theoretical ones. Well, towards the very recent ones, the very recent fictional works by Saadawi, her voice was very loud. That's the problem. The voice of the author, you cannot miss it, see? Sometimes even she manipulated the characters. But before that, no, the woman wrote several novels and plays and all that. So go back to her fiction works, fill in the gaps. Actually, reading both Johns together also can shed some light on her journey, the evolution of her feminism, if one can say so. There was, from the very beginning, it was the tripartite, the tabooed tripartite of sex, religion, politics. So it depended on the phase. Sometimes it's religion coming to the forward and sex going to the background, and so on and so forth. But the three categories were there all the time from the beginning: religion, sex, politics. And they just keep shifting places. So they all go together. So I recommend all the time reading the fiction along with the non-fiction. They both shed light on each other. Thank you.
So much, Shereen. And honestly, I can't think of a better end to our panel today, more than what you said. And I think it really also encapsulates what we have been doing with the open since the start of today, but also with this panel, like reading her fiction, her memoirs, and looking at her activism, East and West, local and global. I think it's all need to be read as one body. Life and work of Nawal Saadawi, it all needs to be read as one body to, as you said very eloquently, Shereen, to fill in the gaps and answer a lot of our questions. Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed our first day. I hope you did as well. Amazing presentations. Thank you all so much. Thanks for our attendees as well. I think Griffin just sent a reminder to all of us that we are starting tomorrow at 10 also a.m. Eastern time, and the US, which is going to be 4 p.m. of course, not a.m., 4 p.m. Cairo time. And we have another amazing panel. And then we have a wrap-up session after that. And we hope to see all of you there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, we can end by giving a round of applause to our panelists. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.